Hey, welcome back, my friend. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Whether you just crawled into bed, you're curled up on the couch with a blanket, or maybe you snuck in one earbud while pretending to sleep next to someone who is already out cold. I see you, and I'm happy you chose to spend this time with me. Tonight, we're going somewhere I think you're going to love. We're stepping behind stone walls. We're walking into a world that most history books skipped right over. Not because it was boring, but because the people who wrote those books simply did not think it was worth recording. And here's the thing that gets me every single time I research this topic. There was a woman living in a castle somewhere in France or England or Germany roughly 800 years ago who woke up before sunrise, managed a staff of over 200 people, settled legal disputes, oversaw harvests, mixed medicines, negotiated political alliances, educated children, and ran the entire financial operation of a medieval estate. And history remembered her husband. Not her, just him. So, tonight we're going to fix that. We're going to talk about what noble women actually did all day behind those castle walls. And I promise you, it is nothing like what you have seen in the movies. Now, before we dive all the way in, if this kind of storytelling brings you something tonight, whether that is a little peace, a little wonder, or just a really good reason to stay under that blanket a few more hours, it would mean the world to me if you hit subscribe and leave a like on this video. You do not have to do it right now, but if at some point tonight you think to yourself, okay, this person really put their heart into this, that is the moment. Drop a comment too if you feel like it. Tell me where you are in the world right now, what time it is, what you're sipping, what made you press play tonight. I genuinely love reading those. Alright, let us get comfortable. Lights low, fan on if you have one. Let that soft hum carry us back in time. Here we go. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. It is the year 1250. Somewhere in northern France, there is a castle, and not the fairy tale kind. Not Disney towers with pink flags and a drawbridge that opens for singing forest animals. No, this is a real castle. Cold stone floors, narrow windows that let in thin blades of winter light, the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and something rich and meaty simmering somewhere far below in the kitchens. The walls are thick, sometimes 12 feet thick, because they were built not for beauty, but for survival. And inside those walls, there's a woman. She has just woken up. It is barely dawn, and before her husband even opens his eyes, before the nights have rubbed the sleep from their faces, before a single servant has swept the rushes from the hall floor, this woman is already thinking. She is thinking about the wheat stores, about the 12 workers who reported sick last week, about the young widow in the village 3 miles east who came to the gate yesterday, asking for help, about the letter that arrived from her husband's brother, the one with the suspicious tone that suggested he might be making a move on a piece of land that is not rightfully his, about the young girl from a neighboring family who arrived last month to be educated here, whose father is an important ally, and whose happiness reflects directly on this household's reputation. She is thinking about all of this before the sun has fully risen, and we have the nerve to call her the Lady of the Castle, as if that title is somehow smaller than Lord. Now, here's where I want to pause because there's a very common image that most of us carry around in our heads when we think about medieval noble women, and that image looks something like this. A beautiful woman in an elaborate gown, sitting by a window, embroidering something, waiting, maybe gazing wistfully out at the horizon, hoping her knight will return. I want you to hold that image in your mind for a second and then gently set it on fire, because that picture, while not entirely invented, only captures about 12 minutes of her entire week. The reality was so much richer, so much harder, and so much more impressive than that. To understand who a noble woman really was, we need to understand what a medieval castle actually was. Because here's something that surprises most people. A castle was not just a home. It was not even primarily a home. A castle was a corporation. It was an economy. It was a government. Medieval scholars who study this period describe the castle household as functioning essentially like a modern executive organization with a full administrative staff, a financial department, a medical unit, a food production and distribution network, an educational institution, and a security operation, all running simultaneously, all under one roof. And right at the center of that entire machine, managing the daily operations, directing the staff, overseeing resources, was her, the noble woman, the lady of the house. Now, One of the questions I find myself asking whenever I dig into this history is, how did a woman end up in this position in the first place? Because on paper, medieval society was not exactly designed to celebrate female competence. The church, which was essentially the moral and cultural authority of the entire era, taught quite openly that women were secondary to men. The law in most of medieval Europe gave women almost no independent legal standing. A married woman could not in most kingdoms own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not bring a lawsuit to court. And yet when you actually look at the historical record, the letters, the household accounts, the legal documents that survive from this period, you see women making decisions, managing resources, writing orders, commanding staff, and wielding extraordinary influence. How does that happen? How do you have power without being officially allowed to have it? The answer is both fascinating and honestly a little heartbreaking. It happened through necessity. Here is something important to understand about medieval life that Hollywood consistently gets wrong. The men were gone a lot. In the feudal system, a lord owed military service to his own lord above him, which meant that during times of conflict, and there were a lot of times of conflict in medieval Europe, the man of the castle could be away for months, sometimes years at a time. The Crusades alone pulled men out of their homes and halfway across the world for campaigns that lasted not weeks but years. And when the Lord was gone, the castle did not pause. The crops did not wait. The rents did not stop being due. The sick did not stop needing medicine. The disputes among servants did not dissolve on their own. And the letters from hostile neighbors absolutely kept arriving. So the woman stepped into every single one of those roles, not reluctantly, not as a temporary stand-in, but as a fully capable, deeply trained administrator who'd been preparing for exactly this moment since she was a young girl. Let me introduce you to someone who can make all of this feel very real. Her name was Margaret Potton. She lived in England in the 1500s, technically a little later than our main period tonight, but she left behind something extraordinary, a collection of letters, real letters, written in her own hand or dictated by her that survived the centuries and give us a direct window into the life of a noble woman managing an estate largely on her own. In one of those letters, Margaret wrote to her husband, John, who was away in London, dealing with the legal matter with a tone that I can only describe as utterly no-nonsense. She informed him of a property dispute that was escalating. She told him what she had already done about it, including organizing armed men to defend the property if needed. She updated him on the harvest, the state of the grain stores, the condition of a tenant who had fallen ill, and the behavior of a steward she did not entirely trust. And then, almost as an afterthought, at the bottom of the letter, she asked if he could please send some sugar and cloth on his way back, because the household was running low. This woman was handling what we would today call legal affairs, human resources, supply chain management, and estate security, and she slipped the grocery list in at the end. If that is not relatable, I do not know what is. But here's what I find most moving about Margaret Paston and all the women like her. She was not exceptional. She was not some rare genius who managed to break through the limitations of her time. She was doing what noble women across medieval Europe did as a matter of course. This was the expectation. This was the training. This was the job. Historical records from France, Germany, England, and Italy all paint the same picture. A noble woman was educated carefully, deliberately from a very young age to be able to step into full command of a household and estate at any moment because the system depended on it. And yet when a husband came home, she stepped back. The record stopped mentioning her. The historian stopped noticing her. And for centuries, that quiet stepping back was mistaken for absence. There's one small detail I want to leave you with before we move deeper in her world. Something tangible, something you can picture. It is the ring of keys. Every noble woman of rank wore a ring of keys at her belt, not as decoration. These keys opened the storerooms, the locked cabinets in the pharmacy, the armory supply closets, the treasury chests. The keys were the physical, literal symbol of her authority. They said in a language everyone in that castle understood, I am the one who controls access to the resources that keep this place alive. And here's the thing about those keys. No one gave them to her reluctantly. No one whispered about it behind her back. No one questioned whether she was capable. They were hers because everyone, including the men, including the knights, including the steward and the cook and the garrison soldiers, knew that without her, this whole world stopped working. She was not decorative. She was essential. And that is exactly where we are starting tonight. With that ring of keys, with that woman standing at the center of a world that needed her completely, even as it refused to fully say so. Because once you understand who she was at the foundation, everything else we're about to discover makes a different kind of sense. Her mornings were not gentle. Her days were not soft. And the secrets hidden inside those stone walls are far more human, far more complicated, and far more beautiful than any fairy tale ever gave her credit for. So stay with me, because in just a moment, we're going to walk through the castle gates together and follow her from the very first bell of the morning through rituals that were never just rituals and into a day that begins long before the Lord ever opens his eyes. Something about mornings feels the same across all of history. That in-between moment, not quite asleep, not quite awake, when the world is still soft and quiet, and you have a few seconds before the weight of the day finds you. We all know that feeling. She knew it too. But for a noble woman in a medieval castle, those few soft seconds ended very quickly. And what came next was nothing short of a performance. Let me paint this for you. The year is still 1250, northern France, or perhaps England. It does not matter much because the rhythm of the morning was remarkably similar across the noble households of Western Europe at this time. The first sound she would have heard before birdsong, before the clatter of servants in the courtyard, was a bell. Not a gentle alarm. A church bell, the bell for matins, or sometimes prime, ringing from the castle's own chapel, announcing that the first canonical hour of the day had arrived. And here is something that might surprise you. This was not optional. Religion in medieval castle life was not the way we think of religion today. Something private, personal, something you can quietly skip when you are tired. In the 13th century, the daily rhythm of prayer was the skeleton of the entire day. The church had divided the day into 8 canonical hours. Matins, Lord's Prime, Terce Sext, Nun Vespers, and Compline, and noble household structured their entire schedule around these bells. To miss morning mass was not just spiritually frowned upon. It was socially suspicious. It suggested something was wrong. Illness and crisis. So she rose. Now I want you to think about what getting dressed actually meant in the 13th century, because this is where the morning ritual gets fascinating in a way that nobody talks about. Imagine being handed 12 separate pieces of clothing and told to assemble them in a specific order that communicated your exact social rank, your family allegiance, your marital status, and your household's current level of prosperity. That is essentially what dressing was. A noble woman's wardrobe was not personal expression. It was a language. The undergarments came first a linen chemise worn close to the skin, which was the one piece of clothing that was actually comfortable. Over that came the kirtle, a fitted dress that shaped the silhouette. Then a surcoat, which might be lined with fur if she was of high enough rank. Then a girdle, a decorative belt worn low on the hips that signaled status through the quality of its metalwork. Then the headdress, which could take a skilled lady in waiting 15 minutes to arrange correctly, and which, if done improperly, would be noticed immediately by everyone in the hall. And she did not do any of this alone. She had ladies in waiting, typically between 2 and 6 women of her own class, or slightly below, whose primary morning duty was to assist with exactly this ritual. Now, here's something I find genuinely interesting about this system. The ladies in waiting were not just helping her dress. They were her first intelligence briefing of the day. While their hands were busy with laces and fabric, their mouths were moving too. They told her what they had heard the night before, which servant seemed unhappy, what the steward had mentioned over dinner, whether the messenger who arrived at dusk had looked nervous, what was circulating in the kitchen gossip, because kitchen gossip in a medieval castle was essentially the household newspaper. By the time she walked out of her chamber fully dressed, she already knew more about the state of her world than most people would know after an hour of reading reports. And she had not even had breakfast yet. Can you imagine starting your morning that way? No scrolling through your phone, no half-awake stumble to the coffee machine. Instead, fully dressed, fully informed, fully present, and walking into a chapel before the sun has cleared the horizon. There is something almost meditative about it, honestly, when you think about it that way. And the chapel visit was not just ritual. For a noble woman in particular, The chapel was one of the only spaces in the castle where she had something resembling genuine privacy. The great hall belonged to everyone. The kitchens belonged to the cook. The stables belonged to the marshal. But the chapel, especially the private family ortry, that most high-ranking households maintained separate from the main chapel, that space was hers in a way very few spaces were. Historians who have studied the devotional practices of medieval women note something remarkable. Many noble women formed extraordinarily deep personal relationships with their chaplain. Not in a scandalous way, though of course medieval gossip sometimes try to make it so, but in the sense that the chaplain was often the one educated, trusted, spiritually serious adult in the castle with whom she could have a completely candid conversation. He heard her prayers. He knew her fears. He knew what she asked God for in the quiet of early morning. And in a world where almost every relationship was tangled up in politics, hierarchy, and obligation, the kind of uncomplicated trust was genuinely rare. After prayers came breakfast, and this is another moment where the popular image of medieval life needs a small correction. We tend to picture lavish feasts, enormous tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, and towers of bread and flagons of wine. And yes, those feasts existed, but the morning meal was nothing like that. Breakfast for the noble family was simple and private bread. Good bread. White bread if the household was prosperous, because white bread required more refined flour and was therefore more expensive. Perhaps some cheese, perhaps cold meat left from the previous evening, and ale. This is the part that always gets people yes ale at breakfast. But water in the medieval period was genuinely risky to drink untreated, and ale was low in alcohol, filling and safe. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a morning smoothie. A very, very humble smoothie. The point is that breakfast was functional. It was not ceremonial. It was fuel, because what came after it demanded full capacity. Here is where the morning truly began. And here is where I think the noblewoman's story gets genuinely extraordinary. Once dressed, prayed, and fed, she moved into the working heart of her day. And the first order of business was almost always the household. A castle of any significant size in 13th century Europe was not managing 10 or 20 servants. We're talking about a functioning community. Estimates from historical records of households from this period suggest that a mid-ranking noble family might have between 50 and 100 people directly dependent on the castle for their livelihoods. A larger household, a countess, a duchess, a woman whose husband held significant territory, could easily be overseeing 200 to 300 individuals, cooks, bakers, laresses, chambermaids, stable hands, blacksmiths, carpenters, pages, squires, musicians, chaplain, tutors, guards, huntsmen, and the ladies-in-waiting themselves. All of them, in the Lord's absence, answer to her. And here is what I want you to really sit with for a moment. She was not overseeing them in a vague, distant, just make sure things run smoothly way. She was operational. She knew which stores were running low. She approved the weekly menus. She handled disputes between servants. And there were always disputes between servants because human nature does not change much. Across the centuries, she managed the budget. She reviewed accounts. She corresponded with local merchants, with neighboring landowners, with the Lord Steward at distant properties. I want to give you a real example here because this is not something I am embellishing. There is a woman named Ella, Countess of Sperry, who lived in 13th century England, roughly the same period we are imagining tonight. Ella was married to William Longest Spey, an illegitimate son of King Henry II of England. When William died in 1226, Ella did not retreat quietly into widowhood. She became Sheriff of Wiltshire, one of the only women in medieval English history to hold that office. She managed the county. She administered justice. She built and endowed Loch Abbey, which still stands in England today, and she became its founding abbess. She lived to approximately 80 years old, an astonishing age for the 13th century, and the historical record shows she was actively managing affairs well into her final years. Now, here's what I find most striking about Ella's story. She was not celebrated as an anomaly by the people around her. The men she worked alongside did not record shock that a woman was doing this. They recorded her decisions, her orders, her judgments as if it were simply the normal thing, which in many ways for women of her class and training it was. Let me tell you about something called the solar. because this is a piece of medieval castle architecture that most people have never heard of. And it tells you everything about the noblewoman's place in the household. The solar, the word comes from the Latin for sun, was a private upper room in the castle, typically on the south or east side of the building to catch the best morning light. It was the noblewoman's room, not the bedroom exactly, that was shared with her husband when he was present. The solar was her working space, her sitting room, her office, though nobody called it that. It was where she received private visitors, where she reviewed accounts, where her ladies gathered to sew and embroider. And we will come back to that embroidery later, because there's a lot more to it than it looks, where letters were written and received, where information flowed in and decisions flowed out. If the Great Hall was the public face of the castle's power, the solar was where the real thinking happened. And that room, warm, well-lit, controlled, was entirely hers. Even when her husband was home, he did not simply wander into the solar uninvited. That was understood. Think about that for a moment. In a society that gave women almost no legal autonomy, almost no public authority, and almost no official recognition, this woman had a room that was functionally inviolable. A space where she could think, plan, govern, and be entirely herself. I find that quietly remarkable. There is one more detail about the morning that I think deserves its own moment, because it reveals something deeply human about what these women carried. Every morning after prayers, and before the day's business truly consumed her, many noble women kept a practice that historians describe simply as the receiving of petitions. People came to her, tenants from the village, servants with complaints, widows asking for assistance from the estate's charitable stores, travelers seeking a night's shelter, local craftsmen with disputes. She heard them. She made decisions. She allocated resources. And this was not charity in the way we sometimes mean it, a distant, impersonal gesture. This was governance. This was the daily, unglamorous, quietly exhausting work of keeping a small community alive and functioning. The medieval church explicitly expected this of noble women. It was called nolus oblige, the obligation of the noble, and it was taken seriously. A noble woman who failed to maintain her household's charitable duties was not just considered unkind. She was considered a failure in her fundamental role. So here's what her morning really looked like when you put all of it together. Before most of her household had finished their first task of the day, she had already gathered intelligence from her ladies while dressing, attended prayers, and held the one honest conversation available to her, reviewed the household's immediate needs over a simple meal, begun the process of managing hundreds of people and thousands of obligations, heard the petitions of those who depended on her decisions, and done all of it in a way that was expected to look effortless, because grace, the appearance of ease under pressure, was considered part of the job, too. Not vanity, not performance for its own sake, but the steady, calm, reassuring presence that kept everyone around her from panicking. She was the emotional anchor of the entire castle. The person everyone from the youngest kitchen, maid to the most senior knight, looked to when things felt uncertain. And things in the Middle Ages felt uncertain quite often. I keep coming back to that image of the keys, that ring of iron keys hanging at her belt, clinking softly as she moved through the corridors of the castle. Every door they opened was a responsibility. Every locked room represented something she had agreed to protect. The grain that would feed everyone through the winter. The medicines that would stand between a sick child and death. The records that documented who owned what, who owed what, and who could be trusted. She carried all of it literally on her body every single morning. And what strikes me most, what I think gets lost when history decides not to write about certain people, is that she did not carry it reluctantly. The women we can trace through historical records, through their letters, their account books, their legal documents, the buildings they founded, and the abbeys they endowed. These women were not victims of their circumstances. They were architects of them. They took what the world offered them, which was limited and often unfair, and they built something extraordinary within it. Now, you might be wondering what happened in the afternoons. What did her days look like when the morning's governance was done and the petitions had been heard? Because the truth is the afternoon brought a completely different set of challenges. Ones that required skills that nobody today would associate with a medieval castle, skills in medicine, in diplomacy and education, and in something as seemingly quiet as a needle and thread, but which, as we are about to discover, was anything but quiet. Stay with me, because the next part of her day is where the story gets even more interesting. Right where we left her, standing in the solar, the morning's governance, barely behind her, the keys still warm at her belt. But now the afternoon is beginning to stretch out, and this is where most people's imagination completely fails them. Because when historians or filmmakers try to picture what a noble woman did with her afternoons, they tend to reach for the same handful of images. Embroidery, reading a psalter by candlelight, perhaps a slow walk in the garden while a troubadour sang something sad about unrequited love. And I want to be fair, those things did happen, but they happened the way a modern CEO might take a 10-minute walk to clear their head. They were the brief restorative pauses between the actual work. And the actual work, particularly in the area we're about to enter, was some of the most consequential, most demanding, and most quietly heroic labor that happened inside any medieval castle. We're talking about medicine. Let me ask you something. If you woke up tomorrow in a castle in the year 1250, and someone in your household fell seriously ill, a child with a high fever, a knight with a wound that was beginning to look dangerous, a servant woman struggling through a difficult labor, who would you call? There were no hospitals within riding distance. There were no trained physicians in most rural areas. The university-educated doctors that did exist in medieval Europe were concentrated in cities where extraordinarily expensive and frankly held opinions about medicine that we would find alarming today, including a heavy reliance on bleeding patients, which was more likely to weaken them than help. So, who did you actually call? You called her the Lady of the Castle, because in the medical ecosystem of medieval Europe, the noblewoman was the primary healthcare provider for every single person living within her walls. And she took that responsibility with a seriousness that honestly puts a lot of us to shame. The first thing you need to understand is that she was not improvising. She was trained from the time she was a young girl, typically sent to another noble household around the age of 7 to be educated, a practice we will return to. In a later part of tonight's story, she was taught an entire body of knowledge about plants, remedies, and treatments that had been accumulated and refined over centuries. This knowledge came from multiple sources, some of it traced back to ancient Rome, specifically to the works of Galen, whose writings on medicine had been preserved and translated through Arabic scholarship and eventually filtered back into European monasteries and noble households. Some of it came from Islamic medical texts, particularly the canon of medicine written by the Persian physician Ibn Sina in the early 11th century, which remained one of the most authoritative medical references in Europe for nearly 500 years. And a great deal of it was practical local generational knowledge, the kind that women passed to daughters and daughters passed to granddaughters, accumulated through observation, through trial and error, through hundreds of years of watching what actually worked. This was not folk magic. This was empirical medicine, rough by modern standards, yes, but often genuinely effective. And the noblewoman was its keeper. Every castle of any significance had what was called a physic garden. This was a dedicated garden, not decorative or not primarily decorative, planted specifically with medicinal herbs. And the variety in these gardens was extraordinary. Lavender for calming anxiety and promoting sleep, something we still use today, as your essential oil diffuser will confirm. Feveroo for headaches and fevers, which modern research has actually validated for migraine treatment. Yarrow for slowing bleeding from wounds. Valerian as a sleep aid, and for what we might today call anxiety. Chamomile for digestive problems. Comfrey, which was called knit bone for helping fractures heal. Hyssop for respiratory infections. Elderflower for reducing fever. The noblewoman did not just supervise this garden. She worked in it. She knew each plant by sight, by smell, by season. She knew which parts to harvest rootly flower bark, and at what time of year each was most potent. She knew how to dry and store them without losing their efficacy. She knew how to prepare them as teas, as picuses, as salves, as tinctures, as syrups. And she knew critically which combinations were dangerous, because some of these plants in the wrong doses or mixed incorrectly were toxic. This was not a hobby. This was pharmacology. There is a woman I want to talk about here, and she is one of the most fascinating figures in the entire history of medieval medicine. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. She was born in 1098 in what is now Germany, and she spent most of her life as a Benedictine abbess. Not a noble woman in the castle sense, but a woman of equivalent rank, education, and authority within her institution. I bring her up because she did something that almost no one in the 12th century did. She wrote it all down. Hildegard produced 2 major works on natural medicine physica and Kosui et Kurai, in which she documented in careful systematic detail the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products. She described treatments for conditions ranging from migraines to heart disease to digestive disorders to what we would today recognize as depression. And here's the part that still impresses medical historians. Some of what she wrote was correct, not in the vague, accidentally true way that we sometimes charitably attribute to ancient remedies. Actually correct in ways that align with what we now understand about the biochemical properties of certain plants. Hildegard was not a miracle worker. She was a careful observer in a tradition of careful observation. And she was doing it 850 years before evidence-based medicine became a formal discipline. Now imagine the woman in the castle next door not writing it down, not getting credited in history books, but practicing the same knowledge every single day. That woman existed in virtually every significant household in medieval Europe. Her name just did not survive. The medical role extended beyond plants, though, and this is where the story becomes genuinely moving, I think. When illness or injury arrived in the castle, and in a world without antibiotics, without sterile conditions, without any understanding of germ theory, it arrived often. The noblewoman became something closer to what we might today call a trauma nurse and a palliative care specialist combined. She cleaned wounds. She applied bandages soaked in honey, which has genuine antimicrobial properties that science has now confirmed. She managed fever by cooling the patient with wet cloths and giving them fluids. She sat with the dying. She comforted the frightened. She made the decisions about when someone was beyond what her remedies could do and needed simply to be kept comfortable and peaceful. These were not small things. They were enormous things, and she did them for everyone. The high-ranking knight who had taken a blade in a tournament. The kitchen boy who had burned his arm badly on a cooking fire. The servant woman laboring through a birth that was not going well. Her own children when fever came for them in the night. Rank mattered for almost everything in medieval life. But in her capacity as healer, the castle's lady treated who needed treating. That quiet equality, I think, says something important about the character of many of these women. You know, one thing that always strikes me when I spend time in this history is how completely we have reframed what these skills mean. Today, if you told someone that a woman was deeply knowledgeable about medicinal plants, managed a large household's health care, and was the first person everyone came to when someone was sick or injured, you would probably describe her as remarkable, possibly as a healer or a herbalist, someone with a TikTok page and a very popular podcast, honestly. But in the Middle Ages, this same woman, this same set of skills was sometimes looked at with a very different kind of suspicion. And here's where the history gets uncomfortable. The period between roughly 1300 and 1700 in Europe saw the rise of what historians have documented as witch trial hysteria in various regions. And scholars who have studied this phenomenon note something deeply troubling. A significant number of the women accused in these trials were described in records as having knowledge of herbs and remedies, as being the person in the village or household that others came to for healing, as knowing things that other people did not know. In other words, the same skills that made a noble woman indispensable and respected were in a lower-ass woman, without the protection of rank and wealth, potentially enough to get her accused. The knowledge was identical. What changed was the social armor. I find that profoundly sad and profoundly important to remember. But let us stay with our noble woman in her castle for now, because her afternoon is not finished yet. After the medical duties, reviewing who was recovering, checking on anyone under her care, perhaps preparing a remedy for tomorrow, came something that occupied a significant portion of every noble woman's afternoon. And this is the thing I promised you we would return to. The thing that looks from the outside like quiet leisure. The thing that is absolutely, completely, and fascinatingly not what it seems. We're talking about the needlework. Picture the solar in the mid-afternoon. The light is good, the best it will be all day, which is exactly why this work happens now. 3 or 4 women are seated together, their hands moving steadily over fabric. The room is quiet but not silent. There is conversation, soft laughter now, and then The occasional pause as someone unpicks a mistake and starts again. If you walk past the door, you would think how peaceful, how domestic, how utterly unremarkable. And you would be completely wrong. Here is the reality of what was happening in that room. First, the economic reality. Textile production in medieval Europe was not a hobby. It was a major industry. And within the castle household, the production and management of fabrics, wool, linen, silk for the wealthiest households was a significant part of the estate's economic output. The noblewoman oversaw all of it, from the shearing of sheep on the estate to the finished garments worn by the household's members. She managed a production chain that required knowledge of raw materials, dyeing, weaving, sewing, embroidery, and the relative market value of different finished products. Her needlework was not separate from her role as estate manager. It was an extension of it. She was quality checking the product. She was setting the standard. She was demonstrating with her own hands the level of craftsmanship she expected from everyone working under her supervision. But here is the part that genuinely changed how I think about this practice. The needlework was also a communication system in a world where women had almost no access to formal written political records, no ability to publish their views, no official platform of any kind. The textiles they produced were one of the few mediums through which they could record history, express opinion, and occasionally send messages that the wrong people would not know how to read. The most famous example of this, and if you have heard of it, you know how staggering it is the Bayeux Tapestry. Created around 1070 to 1080, the Bayeux Tapestry is technically not a tapestry at all. It is an embroidery approximately 68 m long that is roughly 224 feet. It tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in 1066 from Duke William's claim to the throne, all the way through the Battle of Hastings. It is one of the most detailed historical documents from the entire 11th century, and it was made by women. The historical consensus is that it was produced in a professional embroidery workshop, very likely in England, possibly at Canterbury, by women skilled in technique called Opus Anglicanum English needlework, which was so technically sophisticated and internationally renowned that it commanded extraordinary prices across Europe. Now consider this. The men who commissioned this work, the men who fought in the battles depicted in it, the men who would have displayed it, they are the ones history records as the agents of the Norman conquest. But the document that tells us most vividly what that conquest looked like, the visual record that has survived nearly 1,000 years, it was made by women's hands. And those hands made choices. Choices about what to emphasize. Choices about what detail to include in the margins. Because the Bayeux Tapestry's borders are full of small scenes and figures that historians are still debating and interpreting today. Whether those choices were entirely directed by their male commissioners, or whether the women exercised their own editorial judgment, we cannot know for certain, but I know which answer feels more true to me personally. When you are the one holding the needle, the story belongs to you in ways that the person paying you may not fully realize. And this brings us to the solar conversations, because the needlework sessions were also, and I want you to really appreciate this, the most significant and formal information exchange happening in the castle. Medieval social historians have noted repeatedly that the women's workroom was where news traveled. A lady in waiting whose brother was a knight in a neighboring household might mention something she had heard about troop movements. A visitor from another estate might casually describe a tension she had witnessed between two lords that had not yet become public. The noblewoman, listening, stitching, asking a gentle question here and there, was gathering a picture of the political landscape around her that no formal intelligence report could have assembled, and then she would act on it, not loudly, not formally, but in a letter written that evening, in a message sent with a trusted servant the following morning, in a conversation she chose to have with her husband that night about something he perhaps had not considered. This is what historians mean when they talk about women's informal power in medieval society. It was real. It was deliberate. It was sophisticated. It just did not leave the kind of records that end up in the official chronicles. There is something I want to say here, and it is a little personal. When I first started researching the daily lives of medieval noble women, I expected to find a story of constraint, of women hemmed in by walls, literal and metaphorical, doing their best to survive in a system designed to minimize them. And yes, that constraint was real. The legal limitations were real. The expectations were heavy, the risks in childbirth especially, but also in the simple precariousness of a world without modern medicine or stable governance were constant. But what I actually found over and over was something much more interesting than constraint. I found ingenuity. I found women who understood their world with extraordinary precision and worked within it with a kind of elegant strategic intelligence that I find genuinely admirable. They could not own land in their own name in most circumstances, so they became indispensable to the people who did. They could not speak in the great hall with formal authority, so they made sure that the decisions they needed made were reached before anyone sat down in the great hall. They could not sign treaties, so they arranged the marriages that made treaties unnecessary. Every door that was officially closed to them, they found a window, and usually a window with better light. As the afternoon deepened, and the light in the solar began to shift toward gold, her day was still far from over. The evening brought its own entirely different set of demands, ones that required a different kind of skill, a different kind of presence, because now the castle would fill with people again. The great hall would be set for supper. Guests might be arriving, and guests in a medieval castle were never just guests. They were opportunities, obligations, intelligent sources, and diplomatic puzzles all at once. And managing all of that, the performance of hospitality, the strategic placement of people at a long wooden table, the careful navigation of who sat where, and who spoke to whom required a mastery of social architecture that no one ever formally taught, and no one ever formally credited. But she had it. And how she used it in the candle-lit hall as the evening began is a story worth every one of the next few minutes we have together. The candles are being lit now, one by one, carried by servants moving through the corridors of the castle, touching flame to wick in the great hall and the gallery above, along the stone passages that connect the kitchen to the main building. The smell changes from the cold mineral scent of afternoon stone to something warmer, slightly smoky, layered with the aroma of roasting meat drifting up from the kitchen far below. And somewhere in the castle, the noblewoman is preparing herself for what many historians quietly consider the most demanding part of her entire day. Not the accounts, not the medical duties, not the estate management, the dinner. Now, before you laugh and I see you reaching for that thought, let me stop you right there. Because when I say the dinner was demanding, I do not mean the food. Well, the food mattered too. But the dinner in a medieval castle was not a meal. It was theater. It was diplomacy. It was a living, breathing political document played out over several hours at a long wooden table. And she was both the director and the lead performer. To understand this properly, we need to talk about what the Great Hall actually was in the social architecture of medieval life. Every significant castle had one. A large high ceiling room, often the largest single space in the entire building, with a raised ease at one end where the lord and lady sat, and long trestle tables arranged below for everyone else organized in a very precise hierarchy of importance. Who sat where at those tables was not a casual decision. It was a statement. Seating at a medieval feast communicated everything about status alliances and the lord's current political priorities in a language that every person in that room could read fluently, placing someone above or below a certain point on the table. Historians refer to this as sitting above or below the salt because the salt cellar was placed at a specific midpoint, and your position relative to it announced your rank. The entire room was a message, a deliberate, carefully considered message. And who arranged those seats? Who decided where the visiting nobleman from Burgundy should sit relative to the lord's uncle, whose loyalty had been slightly questionable lately? Who determined whether the merchant, who'd been a useful financial contact, should be honored with a position that suggested growing favor? Who navigated the delicate situation of two guests who had a known grievance with each other and ensured they were separated by enough table and enough intervening personalities to prevent the dinner from becoming a diplomatic incident? She did. Every single time the medieval feast has been so thoroughly romanticized in popular culture that I think we've completely lost the reality of what it required. We imagine it as joyful chaos, enormous quantities of food, people laughing and tearing at bread dogs underneath the table, someone playing a lute in the corner. And yes, all of those things were sometimes present, but underneath that apparent festivity was a structure so precise and so intentional that it would make a modern event planner weep with either admiration or exhaustion. Consider the food itself. A significant feast in a prosperous medieval household might involve anywhere from 10 to 20 separate dishes, served in 2 or 3 courses. The variety was genuinely impressive. Roasted meats, fish, dishes, pies, vegetable preparation, sauces, bread, cheese, sweet pastries, spiced wine, and behind every dish was a decision. What you served to a guest communicated your wealth. What you served during a particular season communicated your estate's productivity. What you chose to serve a specific guest, whether you remembered that they had a preference for fish or that they came from a region famous for a particular dish, that you had made an effort to replicate communicated, that you had paid attention, that you had done your research, that they mattered enough to you to know them specifically, not just generically. In a world built on alliance and loyalty, being remembered specifically was extraordinarily powerful, and the noblewoman was the one who remembered. There is a concept that medieval historians use when discussing the social function of the feast, and I find it genuinely beautiful. They call it the politics of the table. The idea is that sharing food in the medieval world was not just sustenance or pleasure. It was a covenant. When you ate at someone's table, you were entering into a temporary bond of mutual obligation and goodwill. The host owed you protection and hospitality for the duration of your visit. You owed them in return a certain standard of behavior and a presumption of good faith. This is why medieval lords and ladies invested so heavily in the feast experience. It was not showing off. Well, it was a little showing off, but primarily it was relationship maintenance. Every significant feast was an opportunity to reinforce existing alliances, repair small fractures in relationships, welcome potential new allies, and demonstrate through the quality and abundance of the table that this household was stable, prosperous, and worth being associated with. And the noblewoman understood every layer of this dynamic with a depth that I find genuinely impressive, because she had to. Her family security depended on it. Let me give you a specific example that makes this feel real. In 13th and 14th century England, the households of significant nobles maintained what were called household accounts, detailed records of expenses, provisions, and hospitality. Some of these have survived, and when scholars examine them, something fascinating emerges. The records show not just what was spent on food, but patterns of hospitality, which households were invited regularly, which visitors received particularly generous treatment, which feast days were celebrated with unusual extravagance. Reading these patterns, researchers can reconstruct entire networks of alliance and obligation. And the woman at the center of those records, the one who directed the household expenditure and oversaw the hospitality, was making choices that shaped those networks in real and lasting ways. She was not randomly generous. She was strategically generous. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. But the feast was not only about the guests from outside. Here is something that people rarely consider. Every person at that table, every knight, every steward, every senior servant, every dependent member of the household was also watching. The people who lived and worked in the castle ate in the great hall. They observed how their lord and lady treated guests. They noted who was honored and who was subtly diminished. They witnessed how the nobleman handled a difficult moment, a guest who drank too much and said something inappropriate, a servant who made an error in serving a piece of food that was not quite right and needed to be quietly managed without making the kitchen staff feel publicly humiliated. How she handled those moments told everyone in that room something about her character. Whether she was someone who would treat them fairly, whether she was someone who could be trusted to manage difficult situations with grace rather than cruelty, whether this household was a place worth being loyal to. Medieval historians note that the quality of a household's internal loyalty, how willing the servants and retainers were to work hard to stay during difficult times, to defend the castle when needed, was directly connected to how they experienced being treated at that table every day. She fed them, not just physically, she fed their sense of belonging, and that mattered in ways that showed up most clearly in a crisis. Speaking of crises, and I promise this connects directly to the dinner table, let me tell you about something that happened in England in 1216. A woman named Nicola Dea was the castellan of Lincoln Castle. Castellan means she was the person in charge of the castle's defense, and she held that position not as a temporary stand-in for an absent husband, but in her own right, a role she had been formally granted. In 1216, during the First Barons' War, Lincoln Castle came under siege. The opposing forces were significant. The pressure on the castle was intense, and Nicola Dea held it for months. With a garrison under her direct command, with supplies she had managed and rationed through exactly the kind of careful provisioning work she had always done with the loyalty of men who followed her, because she'd earned it through competence, through fairness, through the accumulated respect of years of proper governance. When the siege was eventually lifted, and she was asked by King Henry III to surrender the Castellan ship because it was now peacetime and perhaps someone else should take over, Nicola Dea reportedly told the king in essence that she was old and tired and would be glad of the rest. She was in her late 60s. She had just successfully defended a major English castle during a civil war, and her biggest complaint apparently was exhaustion. I think about that response a lot. The quiet understatement of it, the complete absence of drama, as if holding a castle through a siege was simply another thing on the list. Now, what does a military siege have to do with dinner? Everything, actually. Because the reason Nicola Dea could hold Lincoln Castle was not just courage or determination. It was preparation. The grain store she had maintained, the relationship she had built with her garrison, the financial resources she had carefully managed, the loyalty she had cultivated through years of fair and competent governance. All of that was the direct result of the same skills that made a noble woman effective at her dinner table, in her solar, in her accounts room. The feast and the siege are not opposites. They're the same discipline applied to different circumstances. Managing people, resources, relationships, and information, whether in peacetime across a candlelit table or in crisis with arrows coming over the walls, required the same fundamental competence. And she had it because she had been building it her entire adult life. Let me shift the light slightly here, because there is another dimension to the evening that I think deserves its own moment. After the main supper, when the plates had been cleared, and the household settled into the quieter rhythms of the evening, there was often what medieval sources described simply as entertainment. Music was the most common form of household musician, sometimes a traveling minstrel who'd been welcomed in for the night, playing and singing in the hall. And the noblewoman's relationship to music was not passive. Most women of her class were themselves musically educated. They sang. They played instruments, the harp, the lute, the psaltery, and they were expected to do so with genuine skill, not just decorative adequacy. But beyond her own performance, she was also the patron, the person who determined what kind of musical culture her household maintained, which songs were sung, which performers were welcomed back, which poetic traditions were encouraged. And in medieval Europe, where the troubadour tradition was at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, the cultural choices a great lady made had real and lasting influence on what kinds of stories got told. Ellalinina of Aquitaine, and we'll spend more time with her in a later part tonight, is perhaps the most famous example of this. Her court in Poitiers in the 1170s became one of the most celebrated cultural centers in Western Europe. The poets and musicians who gathered there under her direct patronage and influence produced works that shaped the entire tradition of courtly love poetry. The body of literature that influenced everything from Dante to Shakespeare to the romantic comedies you watched last weekend. That literary legacy has Ellalinina's fingerprints all over it. But she is listed in the history books primarily as a queen, not as a cultural architect, not as the person who shaped one of the most influential literary movements in Western history, just a queen. The evening winds down slowly in the castle. The fire in the hall burns lower. The conversation quiets. The servants begin clearing the last of the evening's work. And she moves through this quieting with the same steady awareness she's carried all day, noticing who seemed troubled at dinner, making a mental note to speak with the steward about something he said, thinking through a letter she needs to write in the morning. She never fully stops, not even at the end of the day, because the thing that nobody ever wrote down, the thing that does not appear in the accounts of the chronicles or the household records, is the sheer cognitive load she carried every day. The constant awareness of dozens of people's needs, moods, loyalties, and vulnerabilities. The permanent calculation of resources against obligations. The ongoing reading of a political landscape that shifted constantly and rewarded attention while punishing even brief lapses. We have a word for this today. We call it mental load. And research in modern organizational psychology suggests that this kind of distributed relational multi-priority management is among the most cognitively demanding forms of work that humans perform. She was doing it without salary, without a title that matched the responsibility, and without anyone around her particularly noticing, because when it was done well, it looked effortless, and she made it look effortless every single day. I want to pause here for just a moment and ask you something directly. Have you ever been the person in a room or a family or a workplace who holds all the threads together without anyone quite realizing it? The one who remembers the thing that needed following up, who notices when someone is off, who makes sure the difficult conversation happens before it becomes a crisis. If you have, you know exactly what kind of invisible labor that is, you know the specific exhaustion of competence that goes unacknowledged. And maybe hearing about this woman in her castle 800 years ago, something in you recognizes her, not as a historical curiosity, as a person, because that is what she was. Brilliantly, quietly, stubbornly, gracefully human. The Compline bell rings. The last canonical hour of the day. The final prayers before sleep. She returns to the chapel one more time. The room that bookends her day the way it began it. But something is different about the evening's prayers. The morning's devotion was preparation. This is release. This is the moment when she can finally set down, however briefly, the weight of the keys, and simply breathe. We have spent time tonight in the halls, and the solar at the table, and in the physic garden. We have followed her through the architecture of a day that was never as simple as the history books made it sound. But there is a dimension of her life that we have only touched the edges of. Something that happened not in the public spaces of the castle, but in the deepest private corners of her world. Something that involved the children she raised, or more accurately, and more painfully, the children she sometimes had to let go of. Because the story of medieval motherhood is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire history of women. And the truth of it, the real, complicated, deeply human truth, is something I think you deserve to hear properly told. That is exactly where we're going next. There is a particular kind of silence in a castle nursery at night, different from the silence of the great hall after the feast or the solar after the candles are snuffed out. The nursery's silence has breath in it, small, steady, warm breath from the tiny bodies wrapped in their blankets. And sometimes in the darkest hours of the medieval night, a mother would stand in that doorway and listen to that breathing with an intensity that had nothing peaceful about it. Because in the Middle Ages, the sound of a child breathing was never something you took for granted, not even for a single night. This part of the story is one I've thought about for a long time before deciding how to tell it, because it involves something deeply human. The love between a mother and her children filtered through circumstances so different from our own that it can be easy to misread, easy to judge, easy to project modern feelings onto medieval realities in ways that are not fair to the women who live them. So I want to be careful here and honest, because the truth of medieval motherhood, particularly for noble women, is complicated in ways that deserve more than a simple narrative. Let us start with a number that changes everything. Historians who have studied mortality records, church documents, and household accounts for medieval Europe estimate that somewhere between 30 and 50% of children did not survive to their FTH birthday. Read that again. Roughly 1 in every 2 or 3 children born in medieval Europe would not live to see their 5th year. The causes were relentless and indiscriminate. Infections that we now treat with a course of antibiotics could take a child in days. Respiratory illnesses that we would manage at home with rest and fluids were potentially lethal in a world without modern medicine. Digestive illness from contaminated water or food. Complications at birth that took both mother and infant. The simple, brutal vulnerability of a small body in a world that had no reliable defense against invisible threats. And here's what I want you to understand about how this shaped everything. When you know not as an abstract possibility, but as a lived reality, witnessed in your own household, your own family, your neighbors, your servants, that half of the children born around you may not survive. It changes the way you love. It does not make you love less. It makes you love differently, with a kind of fearful vigilance that is almost impossible to describe if you have not felt it. The noble woman's experience of pregnancy and childbirth was its own particular kind of endurance. Historical records suggest that noble women in the medieval period could expect to be pregnant on average between 4 and 8 times during their adult lives. Many experienced more. Ella of Aquitaine, who we have mentioned before, gave birth to 10 children across 2 marriages. Blanche of Castile, Queen of France in the 13th century, gave birth to 12 children, of whom only 5 survived to adulthood. Margaret Bowett, the formidable mother of King Henry VIII of England, gave birth to her only child at the age of 13, a pregnancy so difficult that she never fully recovered physically and was reportedly unable to have more children afterward. Each pregnancy was a genuine gamble, not metaphorically. Childbirth in the medieval period was one of the leading causes of death for women of all classes. Estimates from historical demographic studies suggest that somewhere between 1 and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death, a figure that sounds small until you multiply across 6 or 7 pregnancies across an entire society, across a lifetime of risk. Many noble women made arrangements, legal, financial, and spiritual, before each birth. Not out of morbidity, out of pragmatic love. They wrote wills. They made provisions for their children's care. They put their affairs in order because they knew with clear eyes that they might not walk out of that room. And yet, and this is the part that I find most moving, they kept going. Not because they had no choice, though choice as we understand it was limited, but because within the constraints of their world, raising children, ensuring the continuation of family and lineage was genuinely meaningful to them. The letters and documents that survive from medieval noble women are full of their children, not as abstract heirs or political assets, but as specific beloved individual human beings. There is a letter from a 13th century French noblewoman preserved in a collection of household documents, in which she writes with visible anguish about a son who has fallen ill, describing his symptoms with careful detail, asking for a specific remedy from a trusted contact, and ending with a line that needs no translation across the centuries. She is simply a mother who is frightened for her child. 800 years disappear in a sentence like that. Now, here's where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and where I think popular history has done medieval mothers a significant injustice. There is a persistent narrative, you've probably encountered it, that medieval women, particularly noble women, were emotionally distant from their children. That they did not bond with infants the way modern mothers do, because high infant mortality made emotional investment too risky. That they sent their babies to wet nurses immediately after birth, and essentially outsourced early childhood. That the system of sending children away at 7 to be educated in other households was a kind of emotional abandonment that reveals a fundamental difference in how medieval people experience parenthood. I want to push back on all of this respectfully, but firmly. Let's take the wet nurse question first. Yes, many noble women used wet nurses, women hired specifically to breastfeed their infants. This is documented and not disputed, but the reasons are more complicated than simple emotional distance. First, there's a practical reality that medieval medicine itself understood, even if it understood it incorrectly. Medieval physicians believed, based on Galenic medical theory that was the standard of the day, that pregnancy and breastfeeding were incompatible. They believed that a nursing mother could not become pregnant or that pregnancy, while nursing was dangerous to the infant. For a noble woman whose primary dynastic obligation was to produce heirs, this created a genuine dilemma. If she nursed each child for the recommended period, she would extend the time between pregnancies significantly, potentially limiting the number of heirs she could produce, which in a world of high childhood mortality was an existential concern for the family. Was this cold calculation, or was it a mother doing what she believed was necessary to ensure that enough of her children survived to secure the family's future? I think the honest answer is that it was both simultaneously, and that holding both truths at once is the only way to understand it fairly. Second, the evidence for emotional distance is much weaker than the narrative suggests. When you actually read the documents, the letters, the household accounts, the wills, the records of spending, a different picture emerges. Noble women spent significant resources on their children's comfort, education, and health. They wrote about them with obvious emotional investment. They intervened on their behalf, sometimes at significant personal and political cost. They grieved when they lost them in ways that are unmistakable across any translation. The historian Barbara Hahn, who spent decades studying medieval family life through legal records, argued convincingly that the idea of medieval emotional distance was largely a myth constructed by later historians who applied modern psychological frameworks to a different cultural context. What looked like distance was often simply the expression of love through the mechanisms available through provision, through protection, through the careful arrangement of a future rather than through the verbal and physical expressiveness that modern Western culture has come to associate with parental love. Different expression, same feeling. Now the question of sending children away at 7. This one genuinely troubles modern sensibilities, and I think it is worth sitting with the discomfort for a moment rather than rushing past it. From around the age of 7, children of the medieval nobility, both boys and girls, were typically sent to live in another noble household. Boys were sent to train as pages and eventually squires, learning the martial, administrative, and social skills they would need as adult knights and lords. Girls were sent to learn the skills of household management, embroidery, music devotion, and the social arts that would make them effective noble women. This was not optional. It was the system. And yes, from a modern perspective, the idea of sending your 7-year-old child to live with strangers feels wrong in a way that is hard to articulate past. But here's what I think the modern judgment misses. Medieval childhood was not understood the way modern childhood is understood. The concept of childhood as a protected developmental stage, a period of extended innocence and play during which children are carefully shielded from adult responsibility, is a relatively recent historical development. In the medieval world, children became functional members of society much earlier. At 7, a noble child was considered capable of beginning real education and real responsibility. Sending them to another household was not abandonment. It was investment. It was saying, I want my child to be educated by the best people available. I want them to build connections that will protect them as adults. I want them to learn from experience rather than just instruction how a well-run household functions. In an era without schools, without universities accessible to women, without any formal educational infrastructure outside the church, the noble household system was the best available option. Did it hurt? Almost certainly for the child leaving home at 7 and for the mother watching them go. But the hurt was chosen carefully in the service of a child's future. That is a recognizable kind of love, even if the form is unfamiliar. Let me tell you about a specific mother, because she makes all of this real in a way that no general description can. Her name was Blanche of Castile. Born in 1188, she was the daughter of Alonso VII of Castile and Eleanor of England, who was herself the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, which tells you something about the remarkable women in that family line. At the age of 12, Blanche was sent from Spain to France to marry the future king, Louis VII. She was a child in a foreign country, separated from everyone she knew, learning a new language, adapting to a new court, and she thrived. She became one of the most capable and politically shrewd queens in French history. But the reason I'm telling you about Blanche tonight is not her political career. It is her relationship with her son. Her son was Louis IX of France, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. Blanche effectively ruled France as regent during his minority and remained one of the most powerful influences in his life and reigned throughout his adulthood. The relationship between them is documented with unusual richness, and what the documents show is a mother of fierce, consuming, sometimes overwhelming devotion. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that Blanche told her son she would rather see him dead than in mortal sin, which sounds, and I acknowledge this, freely alarming by modern standards. But in the 13th century theological framework where the soul's eternal fate was considered infinitely more important than the body's earthly survival, this was the expression of the most profound maternal love available. She was saying, I care about your soul more than your life. That is not coldness. That is a different language of love than the one we speak today. Blanche also demonstrated another dimension of medieval motherhood that I think is chronically underrated. She educated her son personally, deliberately with intention. She involved him in governance from an early age. She taught him by example and by direct instruction how to be a just ruler. The historical legacy of Louis VII as a reforming, conscientious king who genuinely cared about the welfare of ordinary people. That legacy has Blanche's fingerprints all over it. She shaped a king through the intimate, daily, patient work of motherhood, and the chronicles credit him, not her. He is St. Louis. She's in most history books a footnote in his story. There is one more dimension of medieval motherhood that I want to touch on because it speaks to something that I think is universal across all of human history: the management of grief. In a world where losing a child was not an extraordinary tragedy, but a statistically likely reality, medieval noble women developed what historians of emotion describe as strategies for carrying loss while continuing to function. Some of these strategies were religious. The absolute conviction that the child's soul was safe in God's hands, that the loss was temporary in the context of eternity, that grief was appropriate, but surrender to grief was not. Some are practical: the redirecting of love and attention to the living children, the channeling of grief into charitable works done in the lost child's name. Some are creative: for the commissioning of memorial objects, small devotional images, tomb monuments that preserve the child's face and name against the erosion of time. The tomb effigies of medieval noble children that survive in English and French churches today are among the most heartbreaking objects in all of history. I think these small stone figures carved with precise tenderness, placed in chapels where a mother might kneel and pray for the soul she could no longer hold. They are the medieval version of something we would recognize completely: the refusal to let love end just because a life did. Here is what I want to say about all of this as we sit with it for a moment. Medieval noble women mothered under conditions that most of us in our comfortable present cannot fully imagine. They gave birth without reliable medical support. They watched their children face threats they had no power to stop. They sent their children away because the system demanded it. They grieved losses that came with a frequency that should have broken them and often did not. And through all of it, they kept going. They kept managing the household. They kept holding the keys. They kept doing the work that kept everyone else alive, because that was what was required. Because love in the medieval world was not primarily expressed in feelings. It was expressed in showing up day after day after day, no matter what. Somewhere in all of this, in the grief and the resilience and the fierce pragmatic love, there is something I find genuinely inspiring. Not in a sanitized motivational poster way, but in the way that recognizing real human endurance inspires. These women were not heroes in the Hollywood sense. They were not fighting dragons or leading armies, though, as we touched on earlier, and we'll return to some of them, did lead armies. They were doing the harder, quieter, longer work. The work of sustaining life, of keeping the fragile, complicated, perpetually threatened structure of human community intact. One day at a time, one child at a time, one loss absorbed, one grief quietly carried, one mourning risen to despite everything. And yet, for all the weight of what we have talked about tonight, the medical risks, the mortality, the separations, the grief, there's one aspect of the noble woman's relationship with her children that history has almost entirely missed. Something that happened not in the nursery or the birthing chamber, but in the very public spaces of the castle. Something that was in its own way one of the most politically significant things she ever did. And that is the question of education. Not just what her children were taught, but who else she was responsible for teaching. Because a great noble woman's educational role extended far beyond her own family. She was in a very real sense running a school, one that shaped the next generation of an entire class. And the curriculum who designed it, what it prioritized, whose values it embedded into young minds was almost entirely in her hands. That story is extraordinary, and it begins right in the heart of everything we have been building toward tonight. Picture this for a moment. A great hall mid-morning. Not the grand candlelight version we visited at dinner. The daytime version, quieter, more practical. The long tables pushed to the sides, light coming in thin and pale through the high windows. And in one corner of this room, or perhaps in the solar above, or in a smaller chamber set aside for the purpose, there is a group of children, not just her own children, other people's children, 7 years old, 8, 9, 10, 11. Some of them homesick and try not to show it. Some of them pretending to pay attention while secretly watching a spider make its way across the ceiling. And at the center of this scene, directing the whole operation with what I imagine was a combination of genuine warmth and absolute no-nonsense efficiency, is her, the lady of the castle, running an everything but name school. This is something that medieval history has consistently underplayed, and I want to give it the space it deserves tonight, because the noble woman's role as educator was not incidental to her position. It was one of the most structurally important things she did, and its influence radiated outward from her household in ways that shaped entire generations of the medieval ruling class. Here is how the system worked. When noble families sent their children, typically at the age of 7, to live and learn in another noble household, those children were not simply lodged and fed while some tutor handled their lessons. They became part of the household. They worked. They learned by participation. They observed and absorbed. And the primary architect of what they observed, what they absorbed, and how they were taught to understand the world was the lady of the house they had been sent to. She designed the educational environment through her own conduct and through the specific training she directed, which is a more powerful kind of teaching than any textbook has ever managed. Let me be specific about what that education actually looked like. For the young girls who came to a noble household sent there deliberately by their families to be prepared for their own future roles, the curriculum was both broader and more demanding than most people today would imagine. It started with the practical household management in all its dimensions, the oversight of stores, the management of staff, the basics of accounting and resource allocation. This was not theory. They learned by doing, working alongside the lady and her senior household members, gradually taking on more responsibility as their competence grew. They learned to read. And this is something worth pausing on, because literacy among noble women in the medieval period was more common than the popular image of the illiterate Middle Ages suggests. Not universal, not equal to the literacy rates of educated men, but present, and in many households actively cultivated. They read devotional texts, psalters, books of our saints' lives. Some read more widely histories, chronicles, courtly romances. In households with a strong intellectual culture, they might be exposed to philosophy, theology, and natural science in ways that their formal exclusion from universities would suggest was impossible. They were also taught French, which in the 13th and 14th centuries was the language of the European nobility and of international diplomacy. A young English noblewoman who could not speak and write French was simply not prepared for the world she was entering. But here is the dimension of this education that I find most genuinely fascinating. Beyond the practical skills, beyond the literacy and the languages, the young women in a noble household were being trained in something that had no formal name, but was absolutely essential. Call it social intelligence. Call it political literacy. Call it the ability to read a room, manage a relationship, navigate a hierarchy, and project exactly the right amount of authority at exactly the right moment. This was not innate. It was taught through observation, through gentle correction, through the daily experience of watching the lady of the house move through her world and being quietly guided toward the same fluency. A girl who came into a household at 7 and left at 14 or 15 to be married was, if her education had been well managed, a fundamentally different human being than the child who arrived. Not just more skilled, more capable, more aware, more equipped to navigate a world that would never explicitly grant her authority, but would absolutely require her to exercise it. That transformation was the lady's work, and she accomplished it not through formal lectures, but through something much more effective. She accomplished it through the slow, patient modeling of her own life. There is a woman I want to introduce you to here because she understood the power of female education in a way that was almost radical for her time. Her name was Christine de Sand. Born in 1364 in Venice, raised at the French royal court, Christine became something genuinely unusual in medieval Europe. A professional female writer after her husband died when she was 25, leaving her with 3 children and no financial support. Christine did something that had essentially no precedent. She started writing, not as a hobby, as a profession. She wrote poetry, history, political theory, and biographical works. And she found patrons who valued her work enough to pay for it, which in the 15th century for a woman was extraordinary. But the reason I bring Christine Dean into this particular part of our story is a specific book she wrote in 1405. It was called The Treasure of the City of Ladies, or sometimes the Book of the Three Virtues. And it was in the most direct possible sense an educational manual for women. Not for queens specifically, for women at every level of society, from the great noble woman managing a castle to the merchant's wife managing a shop to the servant navigating her employer's household. Christine wrote it with practical, specific, utterly unsentimental advice. She told noble women exactly how to manage their households. effectively, how to handle difficult relationships with their husbands, how to navigate political situations with intelligence and grace, how to maintain their dignity while exercising real power in a world that officially denied them power. She wrote about the education of young women with particular urgency, arguing that girls deserve to be taught to think, not just to manage, not just to be decorative, but to actually think. This was not a popular view in 1405. It was a genuinely subversive one, and yet Christine dedicated her life to it, because she had experienced firsthand what happened to a woman who'd been educated. She survived and thrived in circumstances that would have destroyed someone less prepared, and she had experienced secondhand what happened to women who had not. The fascinating thing about Christine Despizin is that she was not writing fantasy. She was describing with extraordinary precision what the best noble women were already doing in their households. The educational practices she advocated were not new. They were the practices of the best-run noble households of her century and the preceding centuries. She was simply writing them down, making them visible, arguing that they deserved to be deliberate, systematic, and universal rather than dependent on the luck of landing in a household with an enlightened mistress. Which suggests to me that the women she was writing for and the women she was writing about were already running educational institutions of real quality inside their castle walls. They just had not been given credit for it. Now, let me ask you something that I find genuinely interesting to think about. When you consider the most important teachers in your own life, not necessarily the formal ones, not necessarily the ones who stood at the front of classroom, but the people who actually shaped how you think, how you carry yourself, what you believe about what matters, how many of them were women, and how many of those women were doing their teaching quietly through the way they lived, and the standards they held rather than through any formal instruction. I ask because I think there is something in this pattern that connects across the centuries. The medieval noble woman educating the girls in her household was doing something that humans have done in every culture, in every era, in every corner of the world. She was transmitting civilization not through monuments or armies or political declarations, through the slow, patient, intimate work of shaping the people who would carry it forward. For the young boys in the household, the educational picture was somewhat different. And here the noblewoman's role, while less central, was still more significant than history typically acknowledges. Young pages in a noble household, the boys sent there at 7 to begin their training toward knighthood, were primarily under the instruction of the lord and his senior male retainers for their martial training. Swordsmanship, horsemanship, the handling of weapons, the conduct of tournaments, the duties of military service. These were the lord's domain. But the pages also spent significant time in the household's common spaces, at table, in the chapel, in the great hall during the day's business. And in those spaces they were observing her, learning from her example how courtesy worked, how to treat people of different ranks with appropriate respect, how to conduct themselves at table, which, as we discussed earlier, was a form of political literacy in itself. How to speak to a woman of rank, how to manage their own behavior in social situations that required restraint and grace. The code of chivalry that governed medieval knightly conduct was not primarily a martial code. At its heart, it was a social code, and the person who modeled and enforced that social code in the daily life of the castle was the lady. Whether historians noticed it or not, there is a detail from this period that I always find quietly remarkable. In many noble households, particularly in France and England, the noblewoman was responsible for teaching the children in her care to read from the Book of Hours. The Book of Hours was a personal devotional text, illuminated manuscripts, often extraordinarily beautiful, containing prayers organized around the canonical hours of the day. Many noble women owned their own books of hours, sometimes commissioned specifically for them with illustrations that depicted scenes from their own lives, or the lives of female saints they had particular devotion to. These books were treasured objects, sometimes passed from mother to daughter across generations. And teaching a child to read from your own book of hours was an intimate act of a particular kind. You were giving them language. You were giving them prayer. You were giving them the aesthetic standard of the beautiful, because many of these manuscripts were works of art of extraordinary quality. And you were giving them a direct physical connection to you, because your hands had touched those pages. Your eyes had moved across those same words. The prayers the child was learning to read were the same prayers you've been saying since your own childhood. That continuity, that thread of devotion and learning passing from hand to hand across generations, is one of the most beautiful things I've encountered in all of this research. And it happened quietly and completely unremarkably in noble households across Europe for centuries. But the education happening in these castles was not only formal learning and moral formation. There was another kind of knowledge being passed on that we've not talked about yet. Knowledge about the world, about what was happening beyond the castle walls, about politics, about geography, about the movements of armies and the decisions of kings. Because here is something that tends to get overlooked in discussions of medieval women and education. Many noble women were extraordinarily well informed, not despite their restricted access to the wider world. In some ways, because of the specific position they occupied within their household information network. Remember those morning conversations with the ladies in waiting, the dinner table, diplomacy, the letters received and sent, the petitions heard from tenants and travelers. All of that was intelligence, real, specific current intelligence about the state of the world. And a woman who had been doing that work for 20 years had an understanding of the political landscape of her region, who owed what to whom, where tensions were building, which alliances were fragile, which harvests had been poor enough to create instability that was genuinely sophisticated. When she educated the young people in her household, she was passing on some of that understanding, not through formal political lectures, that was not the form it took, but through the stories she told, through the examples she chose, through the quiet, ongoing commentary on events that shaped the way young minds understood the world they were being prepared to enter. Generations of noble men and noble women left the households of great ladies carrying something they could not always articulate. A set of values, a way of seeing, a standard of conduct, a mental map of how relationships worked, how resources were managed, how power was exercised responsibly, and what it meant to lead with something resembling integrity. Whether those lessons stayed with them depended on many things: character, circumstance, the quality of the woman who had taught them. But the teaching happened in hundreds of households across medieval Europe, in the solar, in the chapel, in the great hall, in the garden, in the daily unremarkable, utterly essential transmission of everything that made a civilization function. And the women who did that teaching left no books, no monuments, no official records of their curriculum. They left instead the people they shaped, and those people built the world. That thought that the most important teaching often leaves no trace except in the lives it changed brings us to a dimension of the noble woman's world that we have been circling around without quite arriving at. Because everything we have talked about tonight, the household management, the medicine, the education, the feasts, the motherhood, all of it existed within a framework that the women themselves understood as both constraint and canvas. That framework was the church. And the noble woman's relationship with her faith was far more complicated, far more politically charged, and far more strategically sophisticated than either the pious stereotype or the feminist critique would have you believe. It is a story about power disguised as devotion, about influence that wore the costume of obedience, about the most remarkable loophole in the entire medieval system. And it is a story worth every minute of what comes next. Nay, there's a particular kind of genius that operates best when nobody is watching. When the person exercising has every incentive to appear humble, obedient, and thoroughly unambitious. When the very framework that restricts them also paradoxically hands them one of the most powerful tools available in their society. That is exactly what the medieval church did for noble women. And the women who understood this, who saw the loophole clearly and walked through it with grace and absolute deliberateness, changed the physical, cultural, and political landscape of Europe in ways that are still visible today, literally visible in stone. Let me set the scene properly because context matters enormously here. The medieval Catholic Church was without question an institution built on the theological subordination of women. The official position articulated by theologians from Augustine in the 4th century through Aquinas in the 13th was clear. Women were spiritually inferior, more prone to sin, less capable of reason, naturally subject to male authority in all things. This was not a fringe position held by a few extremists. It was the mainstream theological consensus of the most powerful institution in Western Europe. And yet that same institution contained within its own structure a set of mechanisms through which a woman of intelligence, wealth, and determination could exercise influence and accumulate legacy on a scale that almost no secular avenue could match. The tension between those two realities is where the most interesting history lives. To understand how this worked, you need to understand something about how religious patronage functioned in medieval society. A patron in the medieval context was someone who provided financial support for a religious institution, a church, a monastery, an abbey, a chapel, a hospital, a school attached to a religious house. In exchange for this support, the patron received spiritual benefits, prayers said on their behalf, masses offered for their soul, and the souls of their family members the assurance of ongoing intercessory prayer from the monks or nuns they supported. They also received something far more tangible. They received the right to be associated with that institution permanently. Their name carved in stone above the entrance, their family arms in the stained glass windows, their tomb placed in the most honorable position within the building, their legacy preserved in the institutional memory of a community that was by its very nature built to last. In a world where almost no woman could sign a contract on property in her own name in most circumstances, or leave a public record of her own accomplishments, religious patronage was the one avenue through which a woman could put her name on something permanent. And the wisest noblewomen understood this with extraordinary clarity. The numbers here are genuinely staggering when you look at them. Historians who have cataloged medieval religious foundations in England, France, and the Germanic territories have consistently found that noblewomen were responsible for founding, co-founding, or substantially endowing religious institutions at rates that are dramatically higher than their official political and legal status would suggest. In England alone, between the Norman conquest in 1066 and the end of the 14th century, women of the nobility were involved in the foundation or major endowment of hundreds of religious houses, not as secondary contributors, as primary founders, as the driving force behind the institution's creation. These were not small gestures of piety. They were major capital projects. Building a functioning monastery or convent in the medieval period required land acquisition, architectural planning, construction, management, the recruitment and vetting of a religious community, the establishment of an endowment sufficient to sustain the institution in perpetuity, and the ongoing management of the relationship between the patron's family and the religious house. This was in every practical sense founding a corporation with a business plan, a capital structure, an organizational framework, and a long-term governance model. The women who did this were not simply making pious donations. They were building institutions. I want to tell you about a woman who I think represents this dimension of the noblewoman's world with particular clarity. Her name was Matilda of Tuscany. Born in 1046, she was the daughter of Boniface II Marquis of Tuscany, one of the most powerful lords in northern Italy. By the time she was in her 20s, through inheritance and the early deaths of male relatives, Matilda controlled a territory that stretched across a significant portion of northern and central Italy, land that was strategically vital because it sat between the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor in the north. In the medieval power structure, controlling that geography meant you were automatically one of the most important political figures in Europe. And Matilda was not simply a custodian of that power. She wielded it actively with a strategic sophistication that made hardened diplomats and military commanders take her entirely seriously. But the part of her story that connects most directly to what we're talking about tonight is the role she played in one of the most dramatic episodes of the 11th century. In 1077, a conflict between Pope Gregory VIII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV had reached a point of extraordinary tension. The emperor had been excommunicated. He needed reconciliation with the Pope to maintain the loyalty of his nobles. The Pope needed to demonstrate his authority without appearing to simply capitulate political pressure. Both of them needed neutral ground, and that neutral ground was Matilda's castle, Canossa, a hilltop fortress in what is now the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. Henry IVDH stood in the snow outside Cosa for 3 days barefoot in penitent's robes in January, waiting for Pope Gregory to receive him. This event, the Walk to Cosa, is one of the most famous symbolic moments in all of medieval history. It is cited by historians as a defining moment in the conflict between papal and imperial authority, and it happened in Matilda's house by her arrangement under her facilitation. She was the one who had the relationships with both parties. She was the one who had created the conditions under which this meeting was even possible. She was the one whose castle, whose territory, and whose diplomatic credibility made the entire scene happen. The Pope's biographers recorded it. The Emperor's chroniclers recorded it, and Matilda herself. She appears in those accounts as a host, a facilitator, graciously providing the space for these two powerful men to resolve their differences. Not as the architect of the most significant diplomatic event of the decade, just a host. I find that telling in a way that is almost funny, if it were not also slightly maddening. Matilda's religious patronage was equally significant. She donated enormous tracts of land to the papacy, a donation so consequential that it was disputed by emperors and popes for generations after her death. She endowed churches and monasteries throughout her territories. She supported the reform movement within the church that Pope Gregory was championing, providing it with both material resources and political protection at crucial moments. And when she died in 1115, she was buried with the kind of honor normally reserved for royalty. Her tomb was eventually placed in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. She's one of only 2 women buried there. The other is a Swedish queen. For a woman who had no official title beyond that of her birth, and who spent her life operating within a system that officially subordinated her to male authority. That is a remarkable destination for her remains, but not when you understand who she was and what she did a surprising one. Now Matilda represents an extreme case, a woman of exceptional wealth and political position whose influence reached beyond her own region to shape continental history. Most noblewomen operated on a much smaller scale, but the principle was the same, and the practice was widespread. A noblewoman who founded even a modest religious house, a small priory with a dozen nuns, a chapel attached to a hospital for the poor, a chantry where prayers would be said in perpetuity for her family, was doing several things simultaneously. She was fulfilling her religious duty and accumulating spiritual merit. She was building a family monument that would outlast any castle wall. She was creating an institution that would preserve her family's identity across generations. And she was establishing a relationship with a community of literate, relatively independent women who could serve as a parallel network of information, hospitality, and influence. Medieval convents were not simply places of prayer and retreat. They were institutions of considerable social and cultural weight. Abbesses, in particular, could wield authority that extended well beyond their convent walls, managing estates, conducting legal affairs corresponding with popes and kings, and providing education and care that made them genuinely important community resources. A noblewoman who maintained strong relationships with the convents and monasteries in her region had extended her reach in ways that no formal political structure could account for. She was in essence building her own network using the church as the infrastructure. There is a spiritual dimension to all of this that I do not want to reduce entirely to politics, because that would be unfair to the actual inner lives of these women. The evidence from their letters, their devotional objects, their documented practices of prayer and charity suggests that many medieval noble women had faith that was genuinely personal, deeply felt, and not primarily strategic. They prayed not just because it was expected, but because they believed. They gave not just for the social benefits, but because the idea of obligation to those less fortunate was woven into how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The medieval concept of charity curatus in Latin was not exactly the same as our modern philanthropic impulse. It was closer to a theological conviction about the nature of love itself, that to love God required loving the people God had created, all of them, including the widow at the gate, the child with a fever, the tenant whose harvest had failed. And for many noble women, the management of their household's charitable resources was not a duty separate from their faith. It was an expression of it, the most honest one available to them. But here is where I want to bring in a voice that speaks to this directly, because she is extraordinary and not nearly as famous as she deserves to be. Hildegard of Bingen, whom we touched on briefly in the context of medicine, was so much more than an herbalist. She was by any reasonable measure one of the most remarkable human beings of the 12th century. Full stop. Not one of the most remarkable women. One of the most remarkable people. She wrote theology. She composed music, and her compositions are still performed today, 900 years later. She painted visionary illustrations of her spiritual experiences that are among the most distinctive artistic works of the medieval period. She wrote natural philosophy, medical texts, and a morality play that is considered the earliest surviving example of that dramatic form. She corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and abbots, not differentially, but as an intellectual equal, sometimes as a superior. When she believed Pope Anastasius IV was failing in his duties, she wrote to him and told him so with considerable directness. When Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sought her counsel, she gave it without softening it to the point of uselessness. She founded 2 convents. She went on 4 public preaching tours in her 60s and 70s at a time, when women were not supposed to preach publicly, and she drew crowds. And she did all of this while operating entirely within the framework of the church, not by defying it, by understanding it so completely that she could use it in ways it had not quite anticipated. She claimed divine authorization for everything she did. Her visions, which she began experiencing as a child and documented throughout her life, were the credential that made everything else possible. Because even the most conservative medieval theologian could not easily argue with a woman who said, God told her to do this. The church had its own precedents for female mystics and visionaries. Hildegard simply used those precedents with more thoroughness and more ambition than almost anyone before her. I think about Hildegard a lot when I reflect on this whole question of how women navigated power in the medieval world, because she represents in an extreme and brilliant form something that I think was operating quietly in the lives of many less famous noblewomen. The ability to find the one legitimate avenue available and walk it so completely, so masterfully that the avenue itself expands to contain everything you need to do. The noblewoman in her castle, who could not hold legal office, but managed an estate with executive competence, who could not own property in her own name in most circumstances, but build institutions that bore her family's name in stone, who could not speak in a great hall with formal authority, but shaped every decision made there through the relationship she cultivated and the information she held, who was officially subordinate to her husband in every legal and theological framework available, but who in practice ran a complex human organization with a sophistication that most of those frameworks could not quite accommodate. She found the window. She opened it wider. She passed through every day. Do you know what I find most moving about this particular aspect of her story? The permanence of it. Because when you walk into a medieval church today, anywhere in England, anywhere in France, anywhere in the old territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and you see a window with a family's arms in the glass, or an inscription on a stone floor, or a tomb effigy in an alcove, there's a real possibility that a woman paid for that, chose it, arranged it, ensured it would last. She cannot put her name on a law. She cannot put her name on a treaty. She cannot put her name in the chronicles as a ruler, a general, a statesman. But she could put her name in glass and stone and the carved memory of a community that would pray for her soul for 500 years. And many of them did. Walking into those old buildings today, I sometimes feel like I'm standing in someone's very deliberate, very patient message to the future. A message that says quietly but unmistakably, I was here. I built this. Remember me. That impulse to be remembered, to leave something lasting, to ensure that the work you did not simply evaporate when you did runs through the entire story we've been telling tonight. And it connects directly to the next chapter of her world. Because if there was one thing the noblewoman understood with crystalline clarity, it was the relationship between power and legacy. And the most sophisticated form of legacy building available to her had nothing to do with stone or glass or prayer. It had to do with something far more fluid, far more dangerous, and far more consequential. It had to do with marriage. Not her own marriage necessarily, but the marriages she arranged for others. Because in the medieval world, the art of the strategic, marriage was the art of the possible raise to its highest expression. And the women who mastered it were, in the most literal sense, drawing the map of Europe, one betrothal at a time. Imagine you're playing a chess game, but the board stretches from England to Sicily. The pieces are human beings, sons, daughters, cousins, nieces, nephews, and occasionally yourself. Each move takes years to arrange and decades to play out. And the goal is not to win a single game, but to build a web of alliances so intricately connected, so carefully balanced that your family's position becomes essentially unassailable for the next generation and the one after that. This was the game of strategic marriage in medieval Europe. And the women who played it best were not the kings or the lords whose names fill the history books. They were the women who understood with a depth that came from intimate daily proximity to how human relationships actually work. That a well-arranged marriage was worth 10 military victories because armies could be defeated. But a daughter sitting on a foreign throne surrounded by her own children embedded in a dynasty's bloodline that was much harder to undo. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge something uncomfortable because it lives at the heart of this entire subject. The medieval marriage system was, from a modern perspective, deeply troubling in many of its dimensions. Children were betrothed before they were old enough to understand what that meant. Young girls were sent to foreign courts to marry men they had never met. Women had no legal right to refuse a match arranged by their fathers or guardians. The bodies and futures of young people, particularly young women, were treated as diplomatic currency in ways that would be unthinkable and unacceptable in any modern context. I'm not going to pretend thus is fine, because it was a different time. It was not fine. The suffering it caused was real and documented and deserves to be acknowledged. And at the same time, and this is the complicated part, the women who operated within that system often did so with a level of agency, intelligence, and genuine strategic creativity that gets completely lost when we only see them as victims of it. Both things are true. The system was unjust, and the women within it were not simply passive. Holding that complexity is, I think, the only honest way to tell this story. To understand how marriage worked as a political instrument in medieval Europe, you have to start with what it actually transferred. When two noble families arranged a marriage, they were not primarily arranging a romantic partnership. They were negotiating a legal and financial contract of extraordinary complexity. Land was the core of it. In the feudal system, wealth was territory. A marriage transferred land rights, inheritance claims, and territorial allegiances between families in ways that could dramatically reshape the political map of a region. A daughter who carried rights to a significant territory into a marriage was not just a bride. She was a deed of transfer, a living legal instrument through which her family's territorial claims moved into her husband's hands, or if the family was clever about how the contracts were written, remained partially in her own. The negotiations around these contracts were conducted with the same careful attention to detail that we would expect from a modern corporate merger, because that is essentially what they were. And here is where the noblewoman's role becomes fascinating. Because while the formal negotiations were typically conducted by men, the lord of the house, his lawyers, his senior advisors, the intelligence that informed those negotiations very often came from her. She knew the families. She'd been gathering information about potential partners for her children since those children were infants. She maintained the correspondence networks that kept her informed about the health, character, reputation, and circumstances of candidates across a wide geographic range. She understood the personalities involved, not just the political positions, but the actual human beings. Whether a particular lord was known for cruelty to his household, whether a young noble woman had the strength of character to manage a difficult court, whether a family's apparent prosperity concealed financial vulnerabilities. This was information that no formal negotiation process could easily surface. But she had it, and she shared it through private conversations with her husband, through letters to trusted contacts, through the quiet, persistent advocacy for or against particular matches that she conducted in the spaces between the official discussions. She was the intelligence operation behind the diplomatic process. Let me give you a case study that brings this to life, because abstraction only takes us so far. We need to talk about a woman named Isabella of Castile, not the Isabella who funded Columbus, though she is absolutely worth her own story another time. The Isabella the first want to talk about tonight is her ancestor Isabella of Castile and Leon, who lived in the early 13th century and became Queen of France upon her marriage to Louis VII. Their son was Louis IX St. Louis, whom we have already met through his extraordinary mother Blanche of Castile. But what I want to focus on here is the generation above. The negotiation that placed Blanche of Castile in France, because it was arranged in large part by Eloanina of Aquitaine, who was at the time of this negotiation in her late 70s. Ella of Aquitaine in 1200 in age, when most of her contemporaries have been dead for decades, made a winter journey across the Pyrenees, the mountain range separating France from Spain, to personally evaluate her granddaughters as candidates for the French crown. She traveled in winter across mountains in her late 70s because she understood that the choice of which granddaughter to send to France was too consequential to delegate. She needed to see the girls herself to assess their characters, to make her own judgment about which one had what the role would require. She chose Blanche over her sister Urraca, reportedly in part because the name Urraca, which is perfectly ordinary in Spanish, would sound awkward and foreign in French. A small practical human detail. But that kind of detail is exactly the difference between a marriage that succeeds politically and one that fails for reasons nobody anticipated. Blanche of Castile became one of the most effective queens in French history. The choice was Ella. The journey was Ella. The outcome was Ella work. History calls it Louis VI marriage. Now, Ella of Aquitaine is perhaps the most extreme example of what a noble woman could accomplish through strategic marriage across a lifetime. By the time she died in 1204, Ella had been Queen of France and Queen of England. She had given birth to 10 children, the majority of whom married into the ruling families of England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Castile, and Sicily. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren sat on thrones from Dublin to Jerusalem. Contemporary chroniclers and modern historians alike have called her the grandmother of Europe, and they mean it almost literally. The bloodline she established, the alliances she wove, the territorial connection she created through decades of careful strategic marriage, making touched virtually every significant dynasty in Western Europe. No general ever commanded territory that wide. No diplomat ever forged alliances that durable. And she did it through the one instrument available to her that combined legal legitimacy, political consequence, and the deep human reality of family feeling, the marriage. But here is something that I think gets lost in the Ella narrative because she's so extraordinary that she can make the whole system seem like it only worked for exceptional women. It did not. The same logic, the same use of marriage as the primary instrument of political alliance building operated at every level of the medieval nobility. Not just queens, not just women of continental significance. The noblewoman managing a single castle in Yorkshire or Burgundy or Bavaria was doing the same calculation on a smaller scale. Which neighboring family would make the best match for her eldest daughter? Which alliance would protect her son's territory from the family three valleys over that had been making increasingly assertive claims on a disputed piece of land? Which match would bring a useful infusion of resources at a moment when the estate needed them? Which young man's character, family background, and likely trajectory made him a genuinely good partner for a daughter she loved and whose future she took seriously? These questions were hers, worked through in the solar, discussed in private with trusted advisors, pursued through the correspondence network she maintained, navigated with a patience and a strategic vision that operated on a timescale of decades rather than months. And what about her own marriage? What was the experience of the noble woman within the marriage that was in most cases arranged for her before she had any meaningful voice in the matter? This is where the history becomes genuinely nuanced, and where I think we need to resist both the romantically idealized version and the purely grim one. The evidence suggests a spectrum. At one end, there were marriages that were by any measure difficult. Considerable age gaps between husband and wife were common. A girl of 12 or 13 married to a man in his 30s was not unusual and was not considered scandalous. Some husbands were cruel, some were indifferent, some were absent so frequently that the marriage was essentially a legal and financial arrangement with very little personal dimension. At the other end of the spectrum, there were marriages that were, by the evidence of the documents, genuine partnerships. Couples who corresponded with warmth and evident affection when separated. Husbands who trusted their wives with real authority and acknowledged that trust explicitly. Women who grieved genuinely when their husbands died and did not rush toward remarriage despite considerable political pressure to do so. The historical record does not support the idea that all medieval marriages were cold transactions, nor does it support the idea that they were all great love stories. They were human relationships, with all the complexity, contradiction, and occasional beauty that implies. There is one aspect of medieval marriage that I find myself returning to because it reveals something important about how the noble woman understood her own position. The question of widowhood. In the medieval legal system, a widow occupied a uniquely powerful position. As long as she was married, most of her legal and financial rights were subsumed into her husband's. She could not independently own property, sign contracts, or represent herself in most legal proceedings. But upon her husband's death, something changed. A widow in medieval England and France had significantly more legal independence than a married woman. She could own property in her own right. She could manage her own affairs. She could make decisions about her household, her finances, and her future without reference to a male guardian. She was, in the technical legal terminology of the time, a femme sole, a woman alone, legally independent. This is why widowhood in the medieval period was for women of property a genuinely complex status. On one hand, it meant the loss of a husband, which, if the marriage had been good, was a genuine grief. On the other, it could mean the first real period of legal autonomy in a woman's life. Some medieval noble women chose not to remarry, not because they could not find another match. Women of property were always in demand, but because they preferred the relative independence of widowhood to the renewed constraints of another marriage. Margaret Bowett, who we mentioned briefly in connection with motherhood, was married 4 times. After her 4th husband's death, she took a vow of chastity, essentially declaring that she would not marry again, and spent the rest of her long life managing her own considerable affairs, founding 2 Cambridge colleges, supporting her son's claim to the throne, and wielding political influence that made her one of the most powerful individuals in England. Not the most powerful woman, one of the most powerful people. Full stop. Her widowhood was not a diminishment. It was a liberation, and she used it magnificently. Here's a question I want to put to you, and I genuinely want you to think about it. We've been talking tonight about a world in which women were officially restricted from almost every formal avenue of power. No political office, no military command, no legal standing in their own right while married, no formal title that acknowledged the work they actually did. And yet again and again we find them at the center of things, shaping outcomes, building institutions, forging alliances, educating generations, managing economies. The official record says they were not there. The actual evidence says they were everywhere. What does that tell us? I think it tells us something important about the difference between formal power and real power, about how often across history, the people doing the most consequential work are not the ones with the official titles, about how the systems we build to exclude people are rarely as complete as they claim to be, because human competence, human intelligence, and human determination have a way of finding the cracks and building something remarkable in them. We have spent a long time tonight in the domestic spaces of the castle, the solar, the nursery, the chapel, the great hall. We have followed her through the routines and responsibilities of a life that was by any honest measure extraordinary in its demands and extraordinary in its accomplishments. But there is one dimension of her world that we have touched on and not yet fully entered, one that sits outside the daily rhythm of the household entirely, one that activates only in the worst circumstances when the drums are heard in the distance and the messengers arrive with news that turns the solar quiet in a particular heavy way. We have talked about women who managed estates while their husbands were away. We have mentioned Nicola de Lahaye defending Lincoln Castle, but we've not yet talked about what actually happened when the nobleman found herself not just managing the household in peacetime, but facing the full weight of crisis danger and the need to make decisions that had life and death consequences for every single person inside her walls. The story of the noble woman at war is not a story about exceptional women doing exceptional things. It is a story about the job description that was always there, the one nobody advertised, the one that revealed more clearly than anything else exactly who she really was. And that is precisely where we're going next. The morning the messenger arrived, everything changed. Not dramatically, not with trumpets or shouting. These things rarely announce themselves the way stories suggest. It was usually a rider dusty from the road, arriving at the castle gates in the gray early light. A letter handed to the steward bringing it to her, and then a silence in the solar brief controlled the kind of silence that a woman who had been trained her entire life to maintain composure in difficult moments allowed herself before the thinking began. because the letter said the Lord was not coming home, not dead perhaps, captured maybe, or still in the field, the campaign extending indefinitely. The situation more complex than anyone had anticipated when he rode out 3 months ago. And the castle, every person in it, every acre of land attached to it, every obligation and responsibility it carried was now entirely hers. Not temporarily, not with someone looking over her shoulder. Hers. This is the moment that medieval history has most systematically failed to tell. Not the famous sieges, not the exceptional women who led armies and made into the chronicles, but the ordinary recurring structurally built-in reality that when medieval men went to war, and they went to war frequently for extended periods in service of obligations that the feudal system made non-negotiable, the women they left behind became, in every functional sense, the rulers of what they had left. Not metaphorically. Actually, they collected the rents. They administered the justice. They managed the garrison. They negotiated with neighbors. They made the decisions about whether to repair the northern wall now or wait until spring. They dealt with a creditor who arrived with a legitimate claim and needed to be handled with enough firmness to protect the estate's interests and enough diplomacy to avoid creating an enemy. They did all of this while also continuing to run the household, manage the staff, oversee the education of the children, maintain the charitable obligations of the estate, and correspond with their absent husbands about every significant development. The letters that survive from this period, and there are enough of them to constitute a remarkable historical record, describe women juggling an almost incomprehensible range of simultaneous responsibilities with a calm that I find both admirable and slightly exhausting to contemplate. Let me take you to a specific moment. England 1139, a civil war known to historians as the Anarchy, is tearing the country apart. Two claimants to the English throne, King Stephen and Empress Matilda, the daughter of the previous king, are fighting a conflict that will last nearly 2 decades and leave large parts of England in genuine chaos. In this context, a woman named Empress Matilda herself becomes something that medieval Europe had almost no framework to accommodate. She becomes for a period the effective ruler of England, not queen consort, not regent for a son, a claimant in her own right, fighting for a throne she believed was hers by inheritance. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England. She had been designated as heir. She had the support of significant portions of the English nobility. And when her moment came, when Stephen was captured in battle in 1141, and she was declared Lady of the English, a title carefully chosen to avoid the loaded implications of Queen Regnant, she moved to consolidate her position. She received delegations. She issued charters. She conducted the business of government for approximately 7 months. Matilda was the de facto ruler of England, and then a combination of political miscalculation, the fierce resistance organized by Stephen's wife, also called Matilda, which makes this whole period confusingly but appropriately dominated by women named Matilda, and the shifting loyalties of the London population ended her opportunity. Stephen was released. The war continued, and Empress Matilda eventually withdrew to Normandy, where she spent decades as the most powerful figure in the Duchy and the indispensable support for her son Henry, who had eventually become King Henry II of England. But here's what I want you to notice about this story. The woman who organized the resistance against Empress Matilda while Stephen was imprisoned, who kept his cause alive, who raised troops, who negotiated with potential allies and pressured wavering supporters, was his wife, Matilda of Bologna, a woman who had received no military training, who held no formal command, who was officially simply a wife whose husband was in prison, and yet she held the kingdom together for him through force of will, through diplomatic intelligence, through the kind of strategic clarity that most professional military commanders would have been grateful to possess. The chronicles of the period note her activities with what reads like slightly surprised respect, as if it were unexpected that a woman would be capable of this. As if the entire history of noble women managing crisis while their husbands were absent had somehow failed to prepare the chroniclers for the reality of it when they saw it in action. The mechanics of how a noble woman actually managed a castle under threat are worth understanding in some detail, because the popular imagination tends toward either the helpless maiden version or the warrior queen version, and the reality was more interesting than either. First, The garrison. Every castle of significance maintained a permanent military force. Knights, men-at-arms, archers whose job was the castle's physical defense. In normal times, this garrison was managed by the lord or by a constable appointed by the lord. But when the lord was absent and threat was present, the chain of command ran to her, not because anyone had formally decided this, because there was no one else. And what the historical record shows is that she exercised that command with the same pragmatic competence she brought to everything else. She did not typically fight personally, though some women did. We will come to that. She commanded, she organized, she made the decisions about resource allocation, defensive strategy, communication with potential relief forces, and the management of civilian population within the walls. She decided when to negotiate and when to resist. She assessed the credibility of threats and the intentions of besieging forces with a realism that sentiment could not afford. And she managed the morale of everyone around her, soldiers, servants, refugees who had taken shelter within the walls, with the same quiet steadiness that had always been part of her job. There is a case that I find genuinely remarkable, and it involves a woman whose name deserves to be far better known than it is. Agnes of Dunbar, Countess of March, Scotland, 1337 or 1338. The exact dating varies by source, but the events are documented. Her husband, Patrick, Earl of March, was away on campaign. An English force under William Montague, the Earl of Salisbury, a significant military commander, not someone to be dismissed, arrived to besiege Dunbar Castle. The castle was not considered particularly well provisioned for a siege. The garrison was not at full strength. By conventional military logic, the sensible move was probably negotiation. Agnes of Dunbar held the castle for 19 weeks, 5 months, against a professional military operation with a commander who had the resources and experience to prosecute a proper siege. And she did not just hold it passively. Contemporary Scottish chronicles describe her as actively involved in the defense, appearing on the walls, keeping the garrison's spirits up, directing the response to assault attempts with a hands-on engagement that went well beyond administrative oversight. There are accounts which may be somewhat embellished by later national pride, but whose core is documented, of Agnes personally wiping down the walls with a handkerchief after English forces managed to hit them with projectiles, essentially telling her attackers that their efforts were so negligible she could clean up after them before breakfast. Whether that specific detail is entirely literal or somewhat legendary, what it captures is real. The tone of her defense, the refusal to show fear or weakness, the deliberate performance of confidence that was itself a military tactic, because a garrison that believes its commander is unafraid fights differently than one that can read doubt in her face. William Montague eventually withdrew. Dunbar Castle remained in Scottish hands. Agnes of Dunbar went down in Scottish popular history as Black Agnes, a nickname whose origin is debated, but whose endurance is not. Now I want to pause here and address something that I think is important. Agnes of Dunbar, Nicola de Lahaye at Lincoln, Matilda of Boleyn during the anarchy. These women are sometimes presented as anomalies, as exceptional individuals whose stories are interesting precisely because they were unusual. And I want to push back on that framing thoughtfully, but firmly, because the argument that they were anomalies assumes that the capability they demonstrated was rare, and the evidence suggests it was not. What was rare was the circumstance that required the capability to become visible. The average noblewoman who managed her castle competently through 15 years of her husband's periodic absences, who handled every administrative and logistical crisis that arose, who kept the garrison loyal and the stores sufficient and the estate productive, she never made it into the chronicles. Because nothing spectacular happened, because she was good enough at her job that no crisis ever escalated to the point of becoming a story worth recording. The women who appear in the historical record as defenders of castles are there because they faced extraordinary circumstances. But the competence they demonstrated in those circumstances came from the same training, the same daily practice, the same accumulated experience as the hundreds of women whose names we do not know because their crises never became famous. Excellence in ordinary circumstances is invisible. It only becomes visible when ordinary circumstances collapse, and then we act surprised. There is one more dimension of the noble woman's relationship with war that I think deserves attention, because it is less dramatic than castle defense, but arguably more consequential. The provisioning medieval military campaigns ran on food equipment, horses, and money. And the logistical chain that supplied those things ran very substantially through the estates managed by noblewomen. When a lord rode to war, he needed his estate to continue generating the revenue and resources that funded his campaign. He needed his wife to ensure that rents were collected, agricultural production was maintained, livestock was managed, and the financial records that tracked all of it were kept accurately enough that he could draw on them from a distance. He needed, in other words, a fully competent CEO managing the home operation while he was in the field. And if she failed at that, if the crops failed and she did not arrange alternative sourcing, if the rent collection fell behind and she did not enforce it, if the estate's accounts fell into confusion and she could not navigate them, his campaign ran short resources. His men went unpaid. His horses went unfed. His position in the field became untenable for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy in front of him and everything to do with what was happening 300 m away at home. Military historians who have studied the logistics of medieval campaigns have noted with what feels like genuine frustration that the home-wrought management of noble estates during wartime was absolutely essential to military success and is almost entirely absent from historiography because nobody wrote about it, because it was the invisible foundation, because it was in the end women's work, and women's work has a long history of being treated as the furniture essential, ever-present, and invisible until it breaks. What strikes me most sitting with all of this history is a question of character, not capability, character. Because these women were not just competent administrators who happened to be left in charge. They were people who faced genuinely frightening situations. Siege, financial crisis, hostile neighbors, absent husbands, uncertain news, the constant low-level threat of a world that was not reliably safe, and made choices about how to carry that fear, whether to let it show, whether to let it spread to the people around them who were also frightened, whether to make desperate decisions driven by panic or measure decisions driven by assessment. The chronicles that do record women in these crisis situations consistently note one quality above almost all others. Not strength, not brilliance, steadiness. The ability to remain calm, clear-eyed, and decisive when everyone around them was looking to them for the signal of how frightened to be. This is a form of leadership that does not get statues. It does not get battle songs. It does not get the kind of historical treatment that makes careers and fills textbooks. But it is arguably the most important kind of leadership there is, because a castle whose commander panics falls faster than one whose commander thinks every time. You know what I keep thinking about as I piece this all together? I keep thinking about what it must have felt like to be her. Not in a romanticized way, but in a genuinely human. What was that actually like way to wake up on the morning after the messenger arrived? To look around the solar at the people watching you for direction. To feel the weight of every person in that castle. Every soldier, every servant, every child, every refugee who had come inside the walls because they believed you could protect them pressing against you in a way that was invisible, but absolutely physical, and to decide. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a drawn sword or a moment of cinematic clarity, but quietly, practically, with the same steady competence that you brought to the accounts and the herb garden and the dinner table and the education of other people's children to decide that you're going to hold. That is a kind of courage that has no monument. It is the courage of someone who does not have the luxury of not being brave. Because the alternative, the dissolution of everything she had spent her life building, was simply not acceptable. And yet, for all the weight of crisis and responsibility, there were also the ordinary days. The days when no messenger arrived, when the harvest was good and the stores were full and the garrison was quiet and the children were healthy and the solar was warm in the afternoon light. The days that were just days, days with their own particular texture and rhythm and small pleasures that history almost never records because they were not dramatic. Because they were just a woman's life unfolding in the rooms of a stone castle in the middle of a world that was sometimes terrifying and sometimes beautiful and always complicated. Those days mattered too, maybe more than the dramatic ones in the longer counting. And to understand them fully, to understand what she reached for in the spaces between the crises and the responsibilities and the relentless demands, we need to talk about something that her world valued so deeply that its presence or absence in a household was considered a direct reflection of its quality. something that was both art and language, both leisure and politics, both personal expression and public statement. We need to talk about the role of beauty in her world, about music and literature, and the creation of culture that she did not just consume, but actively shaped about the dimension of her life that was not management or endurance or strategy, but pure, deliberate, irreducible human creativity. That story is richer than you might expect, and it begins with a question nobody ever thinks to ask about a medieval castle. What did it sound like? Close your eyes for a moment. Not to sleep. Not yet. We're getting closer. Just long enough to try something. Try to imagine what a medieval castle actually sounded like. Not the silence that the stone walls and the centuries suggest. Not the grim, echoing emptiness of the castle ruins you might have visited on a school trip, where the wind moves through gaps in the masonry, and the only sound is your own footsteps on broken ground. The living castle. The castle as it actually was. In the morning, the courtyard rang with the sound of horseshoes on cobblestone. The clatter of the kitchen beginning its enormous daily labor. The voices of servants calling to each other across the yard in the particular language of people who have worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. In the afternoon, if you pass near the solar, you might hear women's voices in conversation, the occasional soft note from a harp being tuned the quiet rhythm of work that had its own sound. And in the evening, when the hall filled and the day's tension released into something warmer, there was music. Real music, not background noise, not something playing softly in another room while people talked over it. Music that was the center of attention. Music that was listened to, responded to, and judged with the careful ear of an audience that had been trained to know the difference between good and extraordinary. And the person who determined the quality of that music, who decided what kind of sound her household cultivated, which performers were welcomed, which traditions were honored, which new voices were given space to be heard, was her. The nobleman's role as a patron of the arts is one of the most consequential and least discussed dimensions of her entire historical contribution. And I want to spend some time here because this is where her influence extended furthest beyond her own walls in her own lifetime. To understand why patronage mattered so enormously, you have to understand what the word meant in the medieval context. A patron was not just someone who liked art and gave money to artists. A patron was the economic engine, the creative direction setter, and the quality arbiter of an entire cultural ecosystem. In the medieval period, there was no such thing as a public arts funding body. There was no recording industry, no publishing house, no institution that could take a talented musician or poet and give them a platform. The only way a creative person could develop their craft, find an audience, and sustain themselves materially was to find a patron, a household wealthy enough and discerning enough to support their work, which meant that the taste priorities and cultural values of the women who controlled those households shaped in a very direct and non-metaphorical way what kind of art got made, what stories got told, what music got composed, what ideas got expressed. The noblewoman was not just consuming culture. She was commissioning it. And the difference between those two things is enormous. Let me take you to a specific time and place, because this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Southern France, the late 11th and 12th centuries. The region known as Occitania, the area roughly corresponding to modern Provence and Languedoc, was experiencing something that historians of literature consider one of the most significant cultural explosions of the medieval period: the troubadour movement. The troubadours were poet-musicians who composed and performed in the vernacular Occitan language, the spoken language of the region, as opposed to the Latin of the church and the scholars. They wrote about love, but not love as it had been written about before. They developed a concept that they called fin or refined love or courtly love, a complex, idealized, often unrequited devotion that was philosophically sophisticated, emotionally nuanced, and completely unlike anything the literary tradition had produced before. The poems they wrote influenced European literature for the next 500 years. Dante was influenced by them. Petrarch was influenced by them. Shakespeare was influenced by them. The entire Western tradition of Romantic poetry, the language through which educated people in the Western world have expressed love for centuries, traces a direct line back to a group of poet-musicians in 12th century southern France. And those poet-musicians were in very large part working under the patronage of noble women. The courts of great ladies in this period were the spaces where troubadour culture flourished. Not the courts of kings primarily, not the councils of bishops or the halls of great lords, though those existed too. The solar, the garden, the intimate evening gathering where a woman of cultivated taste sat at the center of a circle of poets and musicians and engaged with their work as a genuine intellectual participant. There is a tradition that historians have both celebrated and debated the so-called courts of love associated, particularly with the court of Mary de Champ, the daughter of Ellalinina of Aquitaine. The idea, as it was described by the medieval writer Andreas Capellanys, was that noble women held formal discussions about the philosophy of love, debating questions like whether true love was compatible with marriage, what obligations love created, how a person of honor should behave in various romantic situations. Whether these courts were entirely real in the formal sense that Capellanys described, or partly literary constructs, is something scholars have debated for generations. But what's not debated is the broader reality they reflect. The great noble households of 12th century France, particularly the households of women like Marita Champin and her remarkable mother Ellalinina, were genuine intellectual centers, places where ideas were taken seriously, where creative work was supported, discussed, and challenged with rigor, where a poet who brought something genuinely new was recognized and rewarded, and where the woman at the center was not a passive audience. She was a participant, a judge, a collaborator. Merida Champin deserves a proper moment here, because she is extraordinary and chronically underappreciated. Born around 1145, she was the eldest daughter of Ellalinina of Aquitaine and Louis VI of France. When her parents' marriage was annulled, she remained with her father in France, which meant she grew up at the French royal court rather than under Ellalinina's direct influence. But something of Ellalinina's intellectual fire clearly ran in the family. Marie became the Countess of Champagne upon her marriage, and the court she presided over at Troyes became one of the most celebrated literary centers in all of 12th century Europe. She was the patron of Traition d'Ada, one of the most significant poets of the medieval period, whose Arthurian romances essentially created the literary tradition of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table as we know it today. Think about that. The entire Arthurian tradition, Lancelot Guyon, the quest for the Holy Grail, the Round itself as a symbol of chivalric idealism in the form that has come down through the centuries into every retelling. Every film, every novel was shaped in foundational ways by a commission from Marie de Champ. Creton d'Artois wrote his L'Enclos, the story that introduced the love affair between L'Enclos and Guyon as its central theme explicitly at Marie's direction. He says so himself in the text. He states that the subject matter and the treatment were given to him by the Countess. He was the craftsman. She was the creative director. And yet when people talk about the Arthurian tradition, they talk about Cretandus, not Mary de Champ. Here is a question worth sitting with. If a woman tells a writer what story to tell, whose story is it? I do not ask that to be provocative. I ask it because I think the answer reveals something important about how we have historically categorized creative contribution. The person whose name goes on the text gets the credit. The person whose vision, whose taste, whose specific instruction shaped what that text became, that person tends to disappear. And in the medieval context, that person was very often a woman, the patron, the one who said, I want a story about this. Tell it this way. Emphasize this dimension. Make the reader feel this. That is creative direction. It is what we would today call a producer, or an editor, or a creative executive. The people in those roles today are recognized as genuine contributors to the work. In the medieval context, the women who did the equivalent work are filed under patronage and moved past quickly. I find that worth noticing. Now, beyond the literary tradition, there is the music itself. And here the story takes a turn that I think will genuinely surprise some people, because not all the noble women in this world were simply patrons of music. Some of them were composers. The most documented example, and we've encountered her before in the context of medicine and theology, is Hildegard Bingón. Hildegard composed approximately 77 musical pieces that survive a body of work that is remarkable both in quantity and in character. Her music is genuinely distinctive, unlike the plain chant that dominated religious music of the period, which typically moved in small stepwise intervals and stayed within a relatively narrow range. Hildegard's compositions leap across wide intervals, soar to high notes, and have a spacious, almost ecstatic quality that sets them immediately apart. Medieval musicologists who have studied her work describe it as unlike anything else from the 12th century. Not because it was technically incompetent, it was technically sophisticated, but because it sounded like someone who was not simply working within a convention, but was genuinely hearing something and trying to transcribe it as faithfully as possible. Her music is still performed today, regularly by professional ensembles and concert halls 900 years after she composed it. That is a legacy of cultural production that most professional composers in human history would give a great deal to match. But Hildegard was not the only woman composing in the medieval period. There was another tradition, secular French, and far less studied of women troubadours. They were called the Trauberets, and they were composing and performing their own poetry and music in the same southern French tradition as their male counterparts. We have surviving works from approximately 20 Trauberets by name. The Comtesse de Dieu is the most famous. Her real name is not known with certainty. She's identified only by her title, but her work survives. For poems and one melody that is among the very few surviving musical settings of Trauberets poetry. Her poems are direct, emotionally honest, and occasionally quite bold for the period. She writes about desire, about loss, about the particular frustration of loving someone who does not fully recognize what they have. She writes in the first person, in her own voice, about her own experience in the 12th century, with a clarity and a specificity that makes her feel surprisingly immediate across all those centuries. There is a line in one of her poems, and I will not quote it directly because translation always loses something, but the emotional core of it is a woman saying essentially, "I have given you everything I have and I wish you understood what that means." That sentiment does not need translation. It does not need a historical footnote. It is just a person writing honestly about love 850 years ago in a castle in southern France. What I find most remarkable about the noblemen's cultural contribution taken as a whole across the century of patronage and composition and literary direction is how deliberate it was. These women were not stumbling into cultural influence. They were pursuing it with the same intentionality they brought to estate management and diplomatic marriage making. They understood that culture was power, not metaphorically, literally. The stories a society tells about itself shape what that society believes is possible, what it values, how it understands relationships, what it considers honor, what it considers love, what it considers worth dying for. A woman who controlled which stories were told in her household, which poems were commissioned, which music was composed, which ideas were given space to develop, was shaping the consciousness of every person who spent time in that space. The pages and ladies in waiting who grew up surrounded by music that celebrated a particular vision of refined feeling. The knights who heard stories about Lancelot and Arthur and carried those stories as their internal model of what honor required. The daughters who absorbed through the very air of the household a sense of what intelligence and cultivation looked like in a woman. This was not soft power. This was the deepest kind of power there is. The power to shape what people believe is real. And yet, even here, even in the space that was most fully hers, the noble woman operated under constraints that she had to navigate rather than simply ignore. The church had definite views about what kind of music was appropriate, about which stories were spiritually edifying and which were dangerously secular, about the difference between harmless entertainment and the kind of courtly love poetry that encouraged from the church's perspective entirely too much focus on earthly desire and not nearly enough on divine devotion. The space between what was officially permitted and what was actually celebrated in the great noble households of medieval Europe was not always comfortable, but she navigated it with the same elegant practicality she brought to everything else, supporting religious music for the chapel, supporting secular music for the hall, maintaining the forms of piety, allowing the reality of culture, finding once again the window. Something about this dimension of her life feels deeply human to me in a way that I want to try to articulate, because I think it touches something real. We all have somewhere in us a need to be not just functional, but beautiful, not just efficient, but expressive, not just surviving, but meaning something. The noble woman who commissioned a poem, who sat at the center of an evening of music she had helped create, who heard a melody she had asked to be composed play for the first time in her own hall. She was meeting a need that the accounts and the estate management and the medical duties could not meet. The need to participate in something that would outlast the keys at her belt and the grain in the storeroom, and even the stone walls around her. Something that was at its root the most human impulse there is. The impulse to say in whatever language is available, "This is what I found beautiful. This is what I believe mattered. This is how I understood the world. Remember this." And now as the evening deepens, and the music in the hall fades, and the candles burn lower, and the castle settles into its nighttime quiet, we arrive at the final piece of her story. The piece that brings everything together. Because we have spent this entire journey watching her work, watching her manage and heal and educate and defend and build and create. We have seen her competence and her resilience and her intelligence and her creativity. But we've not yet asked the question that I think is the most important one of all. The question that sits underneath everything else. When it was over, when the day ended and the night came, and she finally set down the keys and closed her eyes, what did she leave behind? Not in stone, not in music, but in the actual living fabric of the world she'd inhabited so completely. Because the answer to that question is more complicated, more surprising, and more moving than I think any of us quite expect. And it is the answer that changes how you see her, not just as a historical figure, but as a human being whose story is in certain profound ways still unfinished. That is where we are going next. And I promise you it is worth staying awake for just a little longer. Somewhere in England, there is a church. It is not a famous church. It is not on any tourist itinerary. It sits in a small village that most people drive through without slowing down, its stone tower visible above the tree line for about 30 seconds before the road curves away and it disappears. Inside that church set into the floor of the chancel is a memorial stone. The inscription is worn almost smooth by centuries of feet passing over it. But if you kneel down and run your fingers across the letters the way people have apparently been doing for 600 years, you can still make out a name, a woman's name, and beneath it, the dates of a life, and beneath those, a phrase in Latin that translates roughly as "she managed this place well." She managed this place well 600 years, and that is what survived. Not what she felt, not what she built, not what she sacrificed, not what she carried. She managed this place well. I think about that inscription more than is probably healthy, because in its smallness, its magnificent understatement, it captures something that has been true of women's history for as long as history has been recorded. The compression of an entire life into the least threatening possible summary. The reduction of extraordinary competence to its most palatable form. She was here. She did her job. Nothing to worry about. Tonight we've traveled a long way together. We have followed her from the first bell of the morning to the last candle of the evening. We've seen her in her solar, in her physic garden, at her dinner table, in her chapel, at the walls of a castle under siege. We have watched her educate children, manage hundreds of people, negotiate alliances, compose the cultural fabric of her household, carry grief, exercise power in the spaces where power was never officially given to her. And now in this final stretch of the night, I want to ask the question that I think has been quietly gathering. Underneath everything else we have discussed, what did it cost her? Not strategically, not politically, personally. What did it actually cost to be this person? The honest answer requires sitting with something that medieval sources rarely address directly, because the emotional interior life of noble women was not considered historically significant material. The chronicles recorded battles and treaties and the births of heirs. The account books recorded grain and silver and livestock. The letters, when they survive, are largely practical. And yet between the lines of those practical documents, if you read carefully enough, you can sometimes catch something. A word choice that carries more weight than the surrounding text suggests. A phrase that reveals in passing the presence of a feeling that the writer did not intend to document. A gap in correspondence that historians have learned to read as loss. The letters that stop for a month or 3 months that align in the records with the death of a child or a close companion. The inner life was there. It was simply not considered worth recording. And that gap between what was felt and what was preserved is one of the most consequential silences in all of women's history. There is a woman I want to tell you about now, and she represents something important that we've not yet fully addressed. Her name was Neville, born in 1456. She was the daughter of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man known to history as the Kingmaker, one of the most powerful nobles in 15th century England. and Neville's life was, even by the standards of her era, an almost clinical demonstration of what it meant to be a noble woman as a political instrument rather than a political agent. She was betrothed at 14 to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. He was killed in battle when she was 15. She was then, under circumstances that historians have described with varying degrees of diplomatic restraint, as coercive, married to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had become King Richard III of England. She became Queen of England in 1483. She died in 1485 at approximately 28 years old, most likely of tuberculosis. Her only child, a son named Edward of Middham, had died the previous year at approximately 10 years old. She outlived her child by less than a year. She'd been Queen of England for less than 2 years. She was 28. I tell you a Neville story not because it is representative of all noble women's lives. It is not. Many noble women lived long, productive, relatively stable lives. But Anne's story represents the extreme end of a risk that was always present. The reality that the same system that gave noble women their position and their household authority also placed them in circumstances of genuine vulnerability that they had essentially no power to refuse. The marriages arranged without their meaningful consent. The political upheavals that made them pawns in conflicts they had not started. The physical toll of childbearing in a world without reliable medical support. The specific grief of losing children. The specific helplessness of watching your child die and having all your household management skills and all your medical knowledge and all your carefully maintained strength be entirely insufficient. That helplessness was real. It was felt. And it was borne by most of these women in a kind of disciplined silence that I think deserves to be named as one of the most demanding things the role required. Because the noble woman was not permitted by the expectations of her position and her culture to simply collapse under what she carried. She had to keep going for the household, for the children who were still living, for the people whose stability depended on hers. She had to keep going, and most of them did. But I did not want to leave the story there, because ending on pure cost and sacrifice is its own kind of distortion. A different version of the same reductive impulse that compresses a life into she managed this place well. The truth is that alongside the cost, the evidence also shows something else. Something that the women themselves seem to have understood about their own lives. A sense of genuine meaning, not just duty. Meaning, the distinction matters. Duty is what you do because you have no choice. Meaning is what you do because it connects you to something larger than yourself, something that makes the cost worth carrying. And when you read carefully through the letters and the documents and the occasional glimpses into the private world of these women, what you find is not primarily the voice of women who felt trapped and diminished. You find the voice of women who understood with considerable clarity that what they were doing mattered, that the household they managed was not just a building, but a living community of human beings whose welfare depended on them, that the children they raised and educated were not just heirs to a dynasty, but actual people they loved and were responsible for shaping. That the alliances they forged and the institutions they built were genuine contributions to the stability of the world around them. They knew this. They chose it. Every morning when the bell rang and the day began again, that is not tragedy. That is something much more complicated and much more human than tragedy. Let me tell you about a letter. It was written in 1469 by a woman named Margaret Paston. Yes, our old friend from the beginning of tonight to her son John. The context is complicated. The family's in the middle of a property dispute that has been dragging on for years, involving a castle that has been seized by a hostile neighbor. Legal proceedings that seem to go nowhere. Financial pressures that are genuinely serious. And the particular exhaustion of a situation that requires constant vigilance with no resolution in sight. Margaret writes to John with updates on all of it. The legal situation, the financial position, the state of the estate, and then toward the end of the letter, she writes something that stopped me completely when I first encountered it. She tells him that she is tired, not complaining, not asking for help, just noting. In passing in a letter full of practical information that she is tired. And then she moves on to the next item of business, the next thing that needs handling, the next problem that requires her attention. She notes the exhaustion and keeps going. That sentence, small practical, tucked between legal updates, is one of the most honest things I've ever encountered in medieval historical documents because it does not perform strength. It just tells the truth and continues. That to me is more courageous than any castle defense. There is a scholarly debate that has been running through medieval women's history for several decades now, and it touches on something fundamental about how we understand these lives. The debate is essentially this: were the noble women of the medieval period, despite all the evidence of their competence and influence, fundamentally constrained, living partial lives in a system that denied them full humanity? Or were they, within the terms of their own world, genuinely powerful, exercising real agency, building real legacies, living lives of genuine significance? The honest answer, which the best historians of this period have arrived at with varying degrees of reluctance, is that both things were simultaneously true. The constraint was real, the power was real, the cost was real, the meaning was real, and the difficulty of holding all four of those truths at once without collapsing them into a simpler story is exactly what makes this history worth taking seriously. We want a clean narrative. We want either the oppressed victim or the triumphant heroine. We want the story to resolve into something we can summarize in a sentence. And what these women's actual lives offer is something much messier and much more instructive than that. They offer the truth of what it looks like to be fully human inside a structure that does not fully accommodate your humanity, which is, I would gently suggest, not an exclusively medieval experience. Here is something I want to put on the table, and I genuinely want you to think about it. We have spent this entire journey talking about women who are doing work of extraordinary significance, managing economies, healing the sick, educating generations, forging alliances, defending territories, shaping culture, and receiving informal recognition essentially nothing. No official title that matched the work. No entry in the chronicles that captured the scope of the contribution. No monument that said this woman built this civilization. Just occasionally the memory preserved in stone of a name and a date, and the gentle, devastating understatement: she managed this place well. And I want to ask you honestly, does that sound familiar? Not because I want to collapse 800 years of history into a simple modern parallel, but because I think one of the reasons this story has resonance, one of the reasons you're still awake at this hour listening to it, is that something in it touches a pattern that people recognize. The pattern of essential work that goes unremarked, of competence so thorough that its absence would be catastrophic, and its presence is simply expected, of holding things together in ways that no one quite sees until you stop. That pattern is not medieval. It is human. And recognizing it in these women from 8 centuries ago is, I think, one of the most useful things history can do. The legacy of the medieval noble woman is not in the places you would expect to find it. It is not primarily in the castles, though many of those castles were maintained and expanded and survived precisely because of her management. It is not primarily in the churches, though her patronage paid for windows and walls and prayers that have lasted centuries. It is not primarily in the chronicles, because the chronicles largely did not bother. It is in the people, in the generations of men and women who were educated in her household and carried her values, her standards, her ways of thinking out into the world with them. In the communities that survived difficult winters because she had been careful enough about the grain stores. In the alliances that held during crisis because she'd been patient enough about the marriages. In the music that is still performed today, because she recognized something worth supporting in the medical knowledge that was practiced and passed on, and eventually slowly contributed to the body of understanding that modern medicine built upon. Her legacy is diffuse. It is everywhere and nowhere. It is woven into the fabric of things rather than standing separately from them. And that kind of legacy, the kind that becomes indistinguishable from the background of civilization itself, is both the hardest kind to trace and the most profound kind to have. I want to tell you about one more woman before we reach the end of tonight's story. Her name is Julian of Norwich. Born around 1342, she lived through the Black Death, the devastating plague that killed approximately a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. She was not a noble woman in the castle sense. She was an anchor, a woman who had chosen to be enclosed in a small cell attached to a church in Norwich, England, dedicating her life to prayer and contemplation. But she was a woman of her time, formed by the same world we have been exploring tonight. And in 1373, when she was approximately 30 years old, she experienced a series of intense religious visions during a serious illness. She recovered, and then she spent the next 20 years thinking about what she had experienced, and then she wrote it down. The result was a book called Revelations of Divine Love. It is considered the first book written in English by a woman, and it contains a sentence that I think is one of the most quietly powerful sentences in all of English literature. She wrote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." She wrote that in the 14th century, in the aftermath of the Black Death, in a world that had every reason to believe that all would not be well, and she meant it not naively, not as a denial of suffering. She understood suffering with intimate personal clarity, but as considered hard-won theologically. Serious conviction that the story was not over, that what had been lost was not the final word, that the work that had been done, even unrecorded, even unacknowledged, even compressed into 6 words on a worn stone floor, was not wasted, that it mattered, that she mattered, that all the women whose names we do not know, who woke before dawn and held the keys and managed the households and raised the children and defended the walls and shaped the culture and carried the grief and kept going, that they mattered. All shall be well. We've been in this castle together for a long time tonight, and I find myself reluctant to leave it honestly, because something happens when you spend time really looking at these lives, not skimming past them in search of the famous names and the dramatic moments, but actually sitting with the daily texture of what they were. Something shifts in how you see the world around you. You start to notice the invisible work, the held-together things, the steady, unremarkable, absolutely essential competence that operates in the background of every functioning community. And you start maybe to feel a kind of gratitude that is different from the usual historical gratitude. Not admiration for heroism, gratitude for persistence, for the people who kept going when keeping going was genuinely hard, for the people who managed the grain and tended the sick and educated the children and arranged the marriages and held the castles and wrote the music and said, "All shall be well," in the middle of a world that was offering considerable evidence to the contrary. They were extraordinary, and they were ordinary both at the same time. And that, I think, is the most important thing about them. We are almost at the end of tonight, but not quite, because there is one final question I want to bring to you. The question of what we owe these women now, not in a performative abstract sense, but practically, specifically, because the story we've been telling tonight is not simply a pleasant historical journey that ends when you fall asleep. It has something to say about how we look at the present, about who we credit and who we overlook, about what kind of work we recognize as significant, and what kind we file quietly under. She managed this place well, about the windows that are still being found and the things still being built in them. That is where we are going. One last time, and then I promise you can sleep. There is a woman walking toward you right now. Not literally, but stay with me for a moment. She's walking down a hospital corridor at 2 o'clock in the morning, carrying something in her hands, a chart, a medication tray, her phone with 17 unread messages. She's been on shift for 11 hours. She's thinking simultaneously about the patient in room 4 who needs checking the supply order she needs to file before morning, the staff member who seemed off today and might need a quiet conversation, and whether there is any reasonable chance she remembered to defrost something for dinner. She's, in other words, doing something that has a name now. Multitasking, we call it. Cognitive load, invisible labor, the mental work of keeping a complex human system running. Or if you had asked someone in the year 1250 to describe the same set of simultaneous responsibilities, she is doing what the lady of the castle always did, just in different clothes in a different building with better lighting and mercifully indoor plumbing. I want to be careful here, because drawing a straight line from the medieval noblewoman to the modern working woman risks flattening both of their stories into something too neat, too tidy, too satisfying in a way that real history rarely is. The circumstances are genuinely different. The constraints are different. The freedoms available are incomparably different. A woman today, in most parts of the world, has access to legal standing, professional recognition, educational opportunity, and political voice that would have been literally unimaginable to the women we have been talking about tonight. That progress is real, and it matters, and it did not happen by accident. It happened because of choices made and costs paid and ground taken inch by inch over centuries. And some of the ground was taken quietly and without fanfare by women in medieval castles who did not call what they were doing feminism, a word that did not exist yet, but who pushed the edges of what was possible with the same steady, practical, determined intelligence they brought to everything else. Here is the thing about the medieval noblewoman's legacy that I think has not been fully reckoned with. We tend to look at women's history as a story of progress, of gradual improvement, of moving from constraint toward freedom in a more or less linear direction. And that narrative is not wrong exactly, but it misses something important. It misses the fact that extraordinary competence existed in conditions of extraordinary restriction. That the absence of formal recognition did not mean the absence of real influence. That the women who ran these households were not waiting to be liberated so that they could begin contributing to history. They were already contributing massively, structurally, in ways that the civilization around them depended on completely. The liberation that came later was not the beginning of women's significance. It was the belated formal acknowledgement of a significance that had always been there. The work did not start when the recognition came. The recognition was simply very, very late. I want to tell you something that I find genuinely moving about where we are right now in the scholarship of this period. For most of the last 500 years, medieval women's history was essentially invisible. Not because the evidence did not exist. It did. The letters, the account books, the legal documents, the chronicles with their passing, mentions, the household records, the religious foundations, the wills, the inventories of personal possessions. All of it was there sitting in archives and cathedral libraries and museum collections. It was invisible because nobody was looking for it specifically, because the questions historians were asking about kings and battles and treaties and the rise and fall of dynasties were questions whose answers were found in sources that centered men. And so the other sources, the ones that would have revealed the women, were examined for what they said about the men in them, and then set aside. It was not malicious mostly. It was simply a failure of imagination about whose story was worth telling. That started to change in the latter half of the 20th century. Historians, many of them women, though not exclusively, began asking different questions. Not just what happened, but who was doing the daily work that made the events possible. Not just who commanded the armies, but who provisioned them. Not just who signed the treaties, but who arranged the marriages that made the treaties necessary. Not just who built the castles, but who ran them. And what they found when they went looking with those questions was staggering. Not a footnote, not a supporting cast, a parallel history of equal complexity and far greater durability than the one that had been celebrated for centuries. There is a historian named Eileen Power who I think deserves a moment here, because she was doing this work long before it was fashionable. Born in 1889, she was a medieval economic historian at Cambridge and later at the London School of Economics in 1975 posthumously, because she had died in 1940. A collection of her lectures was published under the title Medieval Women. It is a slim book. You could read it in an afternoon, but contains something that was for its time genuinely radical. It treats medieval women not as curiosities or exceptions or unfortunate victims of a patriarchal system, but as historical agents whose lives are intrinsically interesting and historically significant on their own terms. Eileen Power wrote about the noblewoman, the nun, the peasant woman, the merchant's wife, with the same analytical seriousness that her male colleagues brought to kings and bishops and guild masters. She wrote with warmth, with wit, with the particular pleasure of someone who has found something wonderful in the archive and cannot wait to share it. And she argued decades before the argument became mainstream in the discipline that you cannot understand medieval society without understanding the women in it, not as background as protagonists. She was right. And the generations of historians who built on her work have spent the last half-century proving it. So what do we owe these women now? I've been turning this question over for a while, and I want to give you my honest answer. Not a grand gesture, not a performative statement, something more practical than that. I think what we owe them is attention. Real attention. The kind that requires sitting with complexity rather than reaching for simplification. The kind that resists the temptation to make them either victims or heroes, and instead tries to see them as they actually were people. Complicated, capable, limited, resilient, sometimes brilliant, sometimes exhausted, sometimes afraid, sometimes joyful people who live their lives as fully as the constraints around them allowed, and often more fully than those constraints were supposed to permit. When we pay that kind of attention to them, something interesting happens. We start to see the present differently. We start to notice the places where extraordinary competence still operates in conditions of insufficient recognition. We start to ask better questions about whose work is being counted, whose contribution is being named, whose legacy is being preserved, and whose is being compressed once again into a phrase on a stone floor that most people walk over without pausing. The keys. Let's end where we started. That ring of iron keys hanging at her belt, clinking softly as she moved through the corridors of the castle. She managed and protected and made into something more than stone. Every key a responsibility. Every responsibility a choice made again every morning when the bell rang and the day began. I keep coming back to that image because I think it is the most honest symbol available for what she actually was. Not a crown, not a sword, keys, the instruments of access and custody, the things that said, I am the one who decides what opens and what stays closed. I am the one responsible for what is inside. She carried them not because they were given to her reluctantly, or because there was no one else. She carried them because she was the most capable person available for the job in an era that was not always willing to say so out loud, but knew it structurally completely. The entire architecture of medieval castle life was built around her competence. Whether the chronicles recorded it or not, there's a question that I genuinely want to leave you with tonight. Not a rhetorical one, a real one that I think about and that I think is worth your time. If the women we have talked about tonight have been given the recognition they deserved, if their names have been in the chronicles alongside the lords they supported, if their contributions have been formally acknowledged in the legal and political structures of their time, if their intellectual work and their organizational genius and their cultural creation have been credited in the same way their male counterparts were credited, how different would history look? Not different in the sense of different outcomes, necessarily. The battles would probably have been the same. The famines and the plagues would still have come. But different in the sense of what we would understand ourselves to be if the foundational documents of Western civilization had recorded accurately that the daily work of sustaining human community was done by women as much as by men, that the management and the healing and the education and the culture making were shared labors, not gendered ones. What would that have meant for every generation that came after? What stories would we tell about what women are capable of? What expectations would we have? What possibilities would we have seen as normal that we have instead spent centuries treating as exceptional? I do not think that question has a simple answer, but I think asking it is important because the women we have spent tonight with deserve to be more than a fascinating historical curiosity. They deserve to be part of how we understand human capability. Part of the story we tell about what all people can do when they're given responsibility and rise to meet it. Part of the answer to the question of what civilization actually is and who actually builds it. There's one final thing I want to say, and it is personal. I started researching this topic because I was curious about a specific historical question, how medieval households actually functioned, and I ended up somewhere I did not entirely expect. I ended up feeling something that I can only describe as a kind of retrospective solidarity with women I will never know, whose names I will never find, who woke before dawn in cold stone rooms and picked up their keys and got to work and kept the whole fragile enterprise of human civilization running for another day. I feel grateful to them in a way that surprised me. Grateful for the grain they kept in the stores, for the children they educated who grew up to build things, for the music they commissioned that is still being played, for the walls they held literal and metaphorical, for the letters they wrote that give us 800 years later the most honest human documents of the entire medieval period, for the way they kept going, even when tired, even when afraid, even when the chronicles were not watching and the recognition was not coming, and the only record of their lives would eventually be compressed into 6 words on a worn stone floor. They kept going, and that I think is worth knowing, worth remembering, worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are right now before sleep comes. The castle is dark now. The candles are out. The fire in the great hall is burned down to embers. The keys hang on their hook by the door of the solar, waiting for morning, and she is finally at rest. The household breathes around her, fed, warm, safe, managed. The result of 1,000 decisions made well, 1,000 burdens carried without complaint, 1,000 mornings risen to with whatever she had available. She did not need the chronicle to tell her it mattered. She knew the breathing of the household told her every single night, And that, my friends, is where we leave her tonight. Not with a monument, not with a crown, just with the quiet, honest truth of what she was. Someone who did extraordinary things in ordinary language. Someone whose name we mostly do not know, and whose work we cannot fully measure. Someone who, if she could hear this conversation happening 800 years after her time, would probably say something practically useful about the quality of the recording, offer a small suggestion about the pacing, and then ask if anyone wanted something warm to drink, because that is who she was. Thoroughly, beautifully, irreducibly human, and utterly, permanently worth knowing. Thank you. I mean that in the most genuine way I know how to say it. Thank you for staying up with me tonight, for following this story all the way to the end, for caring enough about people who lived 800 years ago to spend these hours with them. That is not nothing. That is actually everything for a story like this one. If tonight gave you something, a new way of seeing a name, you will remember a feeling you did not quite expect. I hope you'll share it. Not because the algorithm needs it, though. I will not pretend the algorithm does not exist, but because these women's stories deserve to be in more conversations than they currently are. Because every time someone shares a story like this, the circle of people who know it grows, and the women who did not make it into the chronicles get a little closer to the recognition they were always owed. Drop a comment if something tonight surprised you. Tell me which woman stayed with you. Tell me if you recognized something in their lives that felt closer to your own than you expected. I read every single one. And if you are new here and this is your first night in this particular corner of history, welcome. There are more stories waiting. Just as rich, just as human, just as worth losing sleep over. Subscribe if you want to find them, because the next story we're going to tell is one that most people think they know and almost nobody knows at all. It begins with a city at the height of its power, a civilization that believed genuinely and with considerable supporting evidence that it had solved the problem of human excellence. And it ends with a question that I think will keep you thinking for days. The way the best history always does. Rest well tonight. You have earned it.